From the heartland of America and the gateway to the West, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation, around the world. I'm George Noory. Welcome to Coast AM. Later tonight, a remarkable story on how cancer was beaten. Here's what's happening. Sometimes you ever drive on a highway and look up at the overpass and you see kids hanging around there? Well, 4 Michigan teens will be sentenced as adults after admitting to playing a disturbing game in which they threw rocks over a busy interstate in 2017. Ultimately, it killed one man. The 4 boys who threw the rock that killed the man were said to be participating in a game called overpassing, where they threw various objects off an overpass on I-75 in Genesee County. Not a funny game. Former special counsel Robert Mueller said in his long-awaited U.S. congressional testimony that he had not exonerated President Donald Trump of obstruction of justice and defended the integrity of his inquiry under repeated attacks by conservative Republicans, allies, of course, of the president. During a day of sometimes dramatic high-stakes political theater, the former FBI director answered questions publicly for the first time on his inquiry in back-to-back hearings with Democrats and Republicans taking familiar positions at a time of deep partisan divisions in the United States. The hearings, with Mueller facing a rapid-fire succession of questions and often sidestepping or merely referring lawmakers to the text of his investigative report, appeared to do little to move the Democrats, who control the House of Representatives, closer to launching the impeachment process to try to remove the president from office, even as he seeks re-election in 2020. I thought Robert Mueller's testimony today was also very shaken. We've got Dr. John Curtis, who does support the president, to react to today. But Mueller seemed a little shaken today, John. Did you feel that?
Well, it wasn't just shaken, George. I mean, you're looking at a tottering kind of old man who's hard of hearing. So, he was there was a very tremulous, kind of shaky voice to Mueller. He was really, fumbling around trying to refer to, different sections of the report, and then referring to very pat answers, really. It's beyond my purview. I can't answer that. The outrageous part of this, George, I mean, for anybody that, follows the law, American jurisprudence and cares about it and cares about the Constitution, is that no prosecutor goes against Department of Justice policy, especially a federal prosecutor, and he's not in a position of exonerating anyone. What he's in the process of doing as a prosecutor is collecting evidence. If the evidence is not there, then the plaintiff, the person that's being suspected of a crime, is not charged, period. He's not in a position of saying whether he's exonerated, not exonerated, whether it's exculpatory or not. So to me, it's like, the report was clearly a biased report. He should have never said anything about exoneration. He should basically said the evidence isn't here to charge him. And in fact, Ted Lieu from California today asked him a question in the morning session and asked him whether the reason he didn't charge Trump was because it was against Department of Justice policy. And Mueller, who didn't realize that he had already told people that's not the reason, said yes. Then in the afternoon session in the Intelligence Committee, he said, I have to retract the statement I made and renege on it because that was not the case. There was not sufficient evidence to charge. So I think the Democrats got slapped today in a very big way. They thought that this was their star witness and they were going to land a knockout blow and a smoking gun on Trump. What they got was absolutely nothing other than what they've been, fantasizing about now since the report came out on March 22nd. That is that Trump obstructed justice and engaged in collusion. Adam Schiff, the chairman of the meeting that was trying to maintain some kind of decorum, has been telling people for the better part of a year that he himself, his intelligence committee, has incontrovertible proof that Trump colluded with the Russians. All of a sudden, what happened to all that information? He never had it. The committee's completely partisan. And the thing that was most glaring and conspicuous was that why is it that the Democrats felt like Trump was, not Trump, but Mueller, rather, was their star witness? And if you notice their demeanor, it was like direct examination. Oh, tell us about this, tell us about that. Anything that would lead Mueller to potentially saying that Trump obstructed justice.
Which he did not say.
Which he did not say. But the Republicans, on the other hand, asked some very tough questions, which he refused to answer, that had to do with the origins of the investigation. Again, saying over and over again that the basis of the investigation was not something that he was prepared to talk about. He wasn't prepared to talk about the original counterintelligence investigation that was started by Comey in 2016 that was directed toward Carter Page, and eventually went ahead and got FISA warrants using the Hillary the paid opposition research known as the Steele dossier. And Mueller deferred any questions related to some just basic information as well. Why didn't you vet the unverified dossier before you conducted an investigation that essentially accused the president of being a Russian agent?
All right, John.
With Russia.
John Curtis, of course, you can track him online, columnist.com. He'll have even more to say about this. Here's an important story. The breast implant maker Allergan has issued a worldwide recall of its BioCell textured implants and tissue expanders due to the risk of a rare type of cancer. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration said it called for Allergan to recall this specific series of models after it was found that these implants were linked to breast implant-associated large cell lymphoma cases. Very important story there. Call your doctor if you had this done. U.S. Foods, a Birmingham, Alabama establishment, is recalling approximately 712 pounds of raw beef and pork products that may be adulterated due to possible product contamination. The fresh and frozen raw beef and pork items were produced July 18, 2019. Where did they go? Well, to recall the establishment, it says EST 21103 inside the USDA mark of inspection, 21103. They were shipped to restaurants in Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, and Tennessee. As we reported yesterday, millions of people who take aspirin to prevent a heart attack may need to rethink the pill popping. Harvard University researchers are reporting daily low-dose aspirin is recommended for people who have already had a heart attack or stroke and for those diagnosed with heart disease. But the otherwise healthy, that advice has been overturned, apparently. Guidelines released this year ruled out routine aspirin use for many older adults who don't already have heart disease and said it's only for certain younger people under doctor's orders. Let's check in with Christian Wild, our expert of myheartbook.com. Christian, what do you think? Do you agree with this study?
Well, George, I remember years ago when you reminded me that Hippocrates had been using aspirin, acyclic acid, for 400 years before Christ.
Yep.
It had a long history, made from the bark of the willow tree. Blood clots are the major killer that literally causes the heart attack and stroke as ischemic heart or stroke disease. Now, more than 200 studies have found that low-dose aspirin, 75 to 100 milligrams a day, reduces the risk of repeated heart attacks and stroke in patients who have already had one or more events, as you just said. So immediately, the common question would be, if it can eliminate or avert the stroke or heart attack in a second and third heart attack, why would it not be effective in eliminating the first heart attack?
You would think that would be a logical question.
That would be the logical question. I wish the medical profession would come to, maybe they have now, a combined comment on aspirin, because wasn't it the 60s, George, and the 70s when the experts were advising taking a low-dose aspirin to avert a heart attack?
Yep, they sure did.
That's what it was.
So this is confusing for a lot of people, Christian.
That's a fact. And how do you know? They do know how many heart attacks and strokes and gastrointestinal bleeds happen to patients. They have no way of knowing how many hundreds of thousands or millions over the years have averted that heart attack or stroke because of ASA. Now, Professor Peter Rothwell, lead author of the University of Oxford, said aspirin was causing 20,000 bleeds annually, including mostly gastrointestinal bleeds, and causing at least 3,000 deaths. Now, there are more effective blood thinners than aspirin, but they're extremely expensive. $454 a month for Eliquis. So if you're going to stop your aspirin therapy, do it. Don't do it cold turkey. Do it with your physician.
Good point, Christian. Christian's website, myheartbook.com. And, of course, he's the one that comes up with a great turmeric with his turmeric research project, myheartbook.com. Up next, Freddy Silva back with us on Coast to Coast with his latest work, The Missing Lands, Uncovering Earth's Pre-Flood Civilization. He's next with us on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Noory with you. We've got a great program for you tonight. First of all, Freddy Silva back with us, author, leading researcher of ancient civilizations, restricted history, sacred sites, and their interaction with consciousness. A leading expert on crop circles, a documentary filmmaker, leads private tours, by the way, to sacred sites all over the planet. A couple of his books include Secrets in the Fields and his latest, The Missing Lands, Uncovering Earth's Pre-Flood Civilization. Freddie, welcome back, my friend.
Hello, George. Last time we spoke, we were in a dressing room in Boulder.
Yes, we were doing our Beyond Belief programs, and you did a marvelous job. Did you have fun doing that?
Of course.
Perfect.
I had a $1 bet that I get you to laugh on screen, and I've managed to get you to laugh on screen.
That's right. You won that bet.
I'm very nefarious.
Indeed. Hey, this new book, The Missing Lands, fascinating. Tell us a little bit about this.
Well, I've been working quietly on a project to basically put together all the missing pieces that people like myself have been working on over the years about this missing civilization that disappeared at the end of the Great Flood about 11,000 years ago, the period called the Younger Dryas. The one thing that really bothered me was the fact that we don't know where all of these gods came from. And also, I suspected for quite a long time that they were all connected. Now, that was the fun part. The hard part was to try and figure out how do you prove this. And, of course, it required doing a lot of traveling around the world and asking not the academics, but going back to listen to the local indigenous people, what they know about the story. Let them tell the story, because their predecessors were so much closer to the events than we are today. Why not let them tell the story, and also to learn a bit of their language? And that's where all the dots began to connect together nicely, because once you understand what these names mean and what they represent, they began to overlap. And when they began to overlap, suddenly all these different people that we've been talking about around the world, from Vita Kosher to the Anunnaki to the followers of Horus, suddenly they're all connected in one beautiful place. So that was a fun little project, which took about 5 years to put together. And as people were saying, the book was supposed to come out a year ago, and they're saying, we're glad you did a bit more extra work because it was worth the effort.
I love the color, the color and the cover of The Missing Lands. Tell us about that island look that we see on the cover.
I used to be a graphic designer when I was being paid for a living a long, long time ago. I wanted to get the idea across that some of the islands that we see today, especially around the Pacific and, of course, the middle of the Atlantic, were part of a missing civilization and a place where they used to live. I just had this uncanny feeling that they were all living on islands, which is why we can't find these locations anymore, these homelands of the gods. So I really wanted to sort of put an island which is on the cover. It's actually taken from the Faroe Islands up in halfway up to Iceland. There is no connection. But below it, there's what looks like a mictake of the original Jaws poster, the film,
yes,
with a shark coming up under the swimmer. And there's a picture of the top of the pyramid coming from under that. So it literally is the juxtaposition of the fact that this civilization is really hard to find now because it's mostly at the bottom of the ocean.
Why do we seem, Freddie, in the ancient times, did they all seem to have some type of god or strange being or figure associated with their culture and civilization?
Oh, absolutely. And this is the one thing that links all of these indigenous people together. They all talk about exactly the same story. So here's the conundrum. The academic model suggests that people 11,000 years ago didn't get around very much. When you talk to these people, they'll say, no, we got around quite well. In fact, we used to go across the Pacific Ocean as easily as you and I go down to the supermarket to get a can of milk. And they were able to connect to each other, and they were able to share stories. But that's not where the stories came from, of the similarity in their traditions. The similarity in their traditions comes from the fact that humans were rescued from a catastrophic global flood, which even reached as far as the Himalaya, which is 3 miles above sea level. And I have a ballistics expert at Los Alamos who actually was studying the effect of objects colliding with the Earth, and especially if they hit deep ocean areas. And the short side of the story is that the ballistics experiments that they did in Los Alamos, which have been published, and I published in the book, do suggest that a certain projectile hitting a certain deep water area will project tidal waves that will cross the entire continent. So they weren't making this up. And what the survivors were saying, because there are 184 flood myths around the world, and they all have exactly the same stories, was that the survivors were picked up by tall people. They had red hair, and they also had blonde hair, green eyes, blue eyes, and white skins, which is a bit unusual in the Pacific, certainly very unusual in Egypt. And they said that there basically were 7 of them. There were craftspeople. One of them was a woman, and she was married to an charismatic leader. And they're all quite tall, but very humanoid. They had the elongated skulls, but they were very comfortable with these people. So, if we go back to the idea that perhaps these people were all very alien, none of these indigenous people ever said this. They said that they were very comfortable with them. They looked just like us. They were just very much taller and very different.
Were they the so-called gods?
Absolutely. But here's the funny thing. It's not in the Christian sense that they were called gods. It was in the sense that back in the day, a god was someone who basically was in total control of the laws of nature. Because a god essentially is a plant or a rock or even a planet was considered a god. Anything that's living in nature was considered a god. Therefore, any person or being who has control of the laws of nature was deemed to be a god as well. There was no distinction between them. So this is where we get caught up into the Christian model of a god, a very almighty being of which we're all afraid of. But they're saying no, that wasn't really quite the case. They were just very intelligent people who are master astronomers, and they're also master navigators.
Does your research, though, kind of back up Genesis in the Bible?
It overlaps it. Genesis was really a strange book. In fact, I've just been reading the late Lawrence Gardner's appreciation of Genesis, going back to the lineage and the birthright of all the gods that created the divine bloodlines here on Earth. And he was also of the opinion that Genesis was so borrowed from so many different sources and then manipulated into a Hebrew, Israeli, Jewish tradition, and eventually a Christian tradition. But if you go back to the original Mesopotamian traditions, it's a very, very different series of stories altogether. But what the thing that made a lot of sense and made a lot of connection was the fact that they do talk about a people called the Lords of Anu, which you and I know, of course, as the Anunnaki, and their craftsmen, who were the Watchers, who get really, really bad public relations because negative things always make the news. But when I was rereading the stories that made up the foundations of the Genesis story, it turns out that the Lords of Anu and the Watchers were actually really nice people. They actually had the best interests of humanity at stake. And it was only a small fraction of the Watchers who basically disobeyed the instructions of meddling with humans that basically get all the attention. But the point is that had the central group of governing people, the actual Anu lords, not intervened in the flood and rescued the surviving human survivors, today the Earth would look very, very different. We would be essentially overrun But what they were describing, and I quote, the bastard sons of the fallen watchers, the small group of people who defied instructions, they mated with human women, and they created these bastard offspring called the Nephilim. And it was their sons that were creating all the problems on Earth. They were eating people, they were creating warfare, and basically they said if we hadn't wiped out humanity and orchestrated the flood, because it was basically the earth in the right place at the right time being hit with what they described as 7 burning suns.
Hold on right there, Freddie, because I want to talk about that, how they created the flood. What do you think they did? What kind of projectile was it? Did they direct an asteroid, or was there some kind of missile or something that blew up? We'll talk about it more with Freddy Silva, his work, The Missing Lands, his website, invisibletemple.com. Welcome back, Freddy Silva with us. Freddie, based on your research, were you able to ascertain what might have caused the historic flood?
It was definitely, and there seems to be some consensus on this, definitely it was a disintegrating comet that hit the Earth. The 7 fragments, according to many of the legends. There may have been a few more as well, and there's quite a few holes that have been found now in the southern hemisphere on the ocean floor that show that the Earth definitely was hit by something that came from somewhere. But again, the part of the clue is also in our folklore, and I kind of came across it by accident as to what the culprit might have been. I was in Peru at the time, which is, of course, in the southern hemisphere, and I just popped into a shop, and I came out about half an hour later, and there's people coming out of all over the place. There's a big sort of celebration going on, and basically they were celebrating the Day of the Dead in the wrong time of the year, when they should have been celebrating it in May, which is what happens in the southern hemisphere. In the northern hemisphere, we celebrate the Day of the Dead, of course, in November, but they were doing it in November as well, and it was a pre-Christian tradition. And I thought, well, this is a bit strange. And they said, well, we also have another Day of the Dead in May. And I'm thinking, well, how many Days of the Dead can you possibly have?
That's right, yeah.
And I began to look at this conundrum in the southern hemisphere, in Polynesia and Fiji, and it kept coming up again and again and again. I'm thinking, this is very weird, because it happened way before the missionaries ever changed the rules in the southern hemisphere. And they said, well, we're commemorating the time when the people drowned during the great flood that swept over the world. I went, aha. Well, you put one and one together and you think, what could have possibly been happening in November that happens again and again and again? Because there's this fear of comets in South America and also in other parts of the world, including India. And I figured, well, wait a minute. The only thing that I know that happens during November is the Taurid meteor shower. And I found out that I wasn't the first person to have thought this as well. There was a writer whose name I can't remember, from the late 1800s, who wrote a small paper for a Masonic institution. It was like a talk in London, I believe. And he basically had mentioned the same thing, that there's this conundrum where people around the world, no matter where they are, which hemisphere, they celebrate the time when our predecessors died in a global catastrophe. And that's when it kind of geology and folklore come together. And basically, it was the Taurid meteor shower. And in fact, we go for this problem every November and every June, because it basically does a big loop through the sky, and the Earth crosses this big path of debris, which is essentially the broken up mass of a small planet that destroyed itself about 30,000 years ago, according to astronomical reports. And this is where we come back to the story of the Anu and the gods, because it was always claimed that these people not only had the control of the laws of nature, but they also had incredible powers of prophecy. They could see into the future. And it happens in the Hopi traditions, it happens in Polynesian traditions, and in Egyptian traditions, that these people could see 300 years into the future. And they said, you know, we are going to be crossing this meteor stream again 300 years from now, and this is the time when big chunks are going to be coming our way.
Oh, boy.
And in the meantime, they were telling the watchers around them, the craftspeople, you need to basically get the renegade watchers under control, and especially their bastard offspring, the Nephilim, which, by the way, means Orion in Aramaic, which is a clue as to where these people are connected to. And they said, if you can't bring these people in who are basically eating humans alive, they're teaching them warfare, they're teaching them all kinds of bad things that you shouldn't be teaching people, unless you can rein these people in, we're going to have to destroy the earth, and we're going to use our given powers to basically divert some very large chunks of rock, which were going to be floating through anyway.
So they sent them our way.
They basically were able to use their power, their will, to basically make sure that the chunks would hit the southern hemisphere in all the deepest parts of the ocean to generate a massive flood. And I was reading the original texts on this, and it was a terrible, bittersweet moment. They were totally ashamed of what they'd done, but they said, we had no choice, because if we hadn't done this, the giants would have taken over. They would have destroyed humanity, and today we would have been on a planet with humans, but we would have had a planet of very tall giants with red hair all over their body, which incredibly are still described in the Solomon Islands. They say that the local people still say that those people are still living in the mountains. They're alive today. They're about 18 feet tall. And I remember one story by a U.S. Group of soldiers that were stationed there, that they said, you know what, we used to sleep with a revolver under our pillow, not because we're afraid of the Japanese attacking us, but because we're afraid of being attacked by the really tall, red-haired giant people that live up in the mountains.
That's fascinating.
Not that they ever caused any trouble, but when you see them, they are quite unnerving.
I bet.
Yeah, and they were kept. Their bodies also washed up in the shores of New Zealand as much as up to the 1950s, and the Maori also were talking about the red-head giants that lived in hills called the Hill of the Red-Head Giants in the northern island of New Zealand as far as the 19th century. And all of those documents are now sealed by government order. So I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I'm beginning to realize that there's more to this story than meets the eye.
What's amazing to me, though, Freddie, is, again, how the Bible echoes a lot of the things that you've uncovered or backed up. I mean, they had it pretty accurate, didn't they?
They had it fairly accurate. The problem began when the church and also when the Jewish people began to stake out their spiritual claim, and they began to make the Anunnaki look like the bad people, the fallen gods, the angels that fell to earth, and the bad people, the satanic people. That's the impression we're left with, and that diverges totally from the original Mesopotamian story. And the Mesopotamian story is where the Babylonians took their information from, and it was from the Babylonians that the Hebrews, and I claim, based on the Babylonian tradition, the Hebrews stole their stories and put a political, religious twist to assert their superiority over the clans over that region in that era. So you got to look at the story in context of the time when the Bible was being assembled to give superiority to a new group of people. But then again, the Babylonians had done the same thing to the Sumerian version of the flood anyway. Sure. So it's a bit of, in the case of the pot calling the kettle black, but we are left with that impression. But if you go away from the Christian tradition, back into the Pacific and into the traditions of South America and even the Native American Southwest, the story is much, much different. The gods were always there to assist people. They were always helpful. In fact, it was because of them that we even have today's Hopi tradition alive, because they describe the people that helped them survive the flood from a sinking island somewhere in the Pacific called the Lookers. And when I was talking to Clifford Mahuti about this, he said, well, you know these people very well because you come across them in your research again and again. They were involved with the original crop circle phenomenon. And I said, are you talking about the Watchers? And I said, yeah, that's what we call the Watchers. We call them the Lookers. They're the ones that helped us come to the southwest of America from a sunken land in the middle of the Pacific, somewhere in the region of today's Samoa. And in fact, the names for serpents in the Hopi language and also in the Samoan traditions are one and the same. So there is that suggestion that somewhere in Samoa there was part of our original homeland as well.
Where does Noah fit in with all of this? Was he a real person?
Oh, absolutely, but that probably wasn't his real name. It's a bit like Enoch. That wasn't his real name either. The names were changed to suit, again, the Jewish Hebrew tradition that were trying to create this new image for themselves. But Noah essentially was one of the, he was the grandson of Enoch, I believe. He also looked very, very unusual. He was a bit different from ordinary humans. So if you go back to his great-grandfather, who was Enoch, or his real name was Emed Iowanu, he was actually one of the children of the Anunnaki. He was a scribe. And he was being told by the Lord Anu to prepare his great-grandson for the great flood, which would be arriving in 200 years from now.
Because they knew they were going to direct a part of the comet.
Exactly, and that story also appears in the Egyptian traditions as well. The original gods, the followers of Horus, whose nickname was the Shining Ones, which is the nickname of the Anunnaki and the Watchers, were being told, yes, there are large fragments coming this way. We need to build some repositories which are going to withstand big waves. And that's where the pharaohs said, can we get the astronomers in here, including Thoth, or his real name was Jehuti, get the ibis-headed god in here? We need to build some large buildings to put all the information so the survivors can pick up where we left off. And that's where they began to build pyramids. And that's actually in the ancient Egyptian texts.
This is fascinating. It is. Now, where does God fit into the picture here? Because, we were raised all along as we were kids that, God instructed Noah to build the ark, that he did this, that he did that. Even though I believe in a divine creator, it makes you wonder what the relationship of God was during those days.
Well, that's where the late Lawrence Gardner comes in very handy, because he had some wonderful access to information that we don't have. He had access to libraries where there are books that museums would like to get their hands on. So, of course, he has to be very careful about, or he had to be careful about his sources. And I had a chance to talk about this with him a few years ago when he was still alive. And he made a very good point that originally, if you read the Genesis story as it is today, he said originally it wasn't a god, there were gods, plural. But as the Hebrew people and the Jewish people began to basically create their own image for themselves, they began to put the focus on one God, Jehovah or Yahweh, which turns out to have been the Bedouin god of war. Which, if you're going to start your religion based on the god of war, it's not going to end well. But if you look carefully at the original story of the flood, and before the flood, it talks about gods, plural, and that's where we get confused in the Christian tradition. So the gods that they were talking about were the lords of Anu, who are also called the Viracochas in South America. All of these people basically are all the same group of people. They just go by different names. We just had no idea, because all the names are in different parts of the world, but they call them by different things. It's only when you travel as much as I do and ask the local people what they're talking about and what they mean, they're saying, well, those actually aren't the real names. They were actually titles of office. And once you look at the titles of office, the titles overlap, and that's when you realize this is a global brotherhood that they had here. So originally there was gods. There wasn't just a god. And I agree, there is a creator god that's out there somewhere, and probably inside us as well. But what they were actually describing in the Bible originally was the group of gods called the Anunnaki, that then get demonized in order for political reasons.
Is that why the Greeks always had their series of gods as well?
Well, that's where it gets a bit more confusing. Now, as soon as we start getting to the historical era, we have to now look at where the Greeks were getting their information from. And they were spending a lot of time in Egypt, I'd say about 3,500 years ago now. And by this time, Egypt has already faded quite a lot. So the priests know that their time is up. They're going to start giving the information to the Greeks. Now, the Greeks are having a hard time trying to translate from Egyptian into Greek, and also to spin the story in a way that they can sell to the Greeks, because obviously cultural differences come into play here. And they began to actually mythologize the gods in order to attract the attention of their population. So in order to understand what the Greek gods were up to, you have to understand the basis from where the stories come from, and that's the Egyptian gods. And then it makes a lot of sense, because by the time you get to the Romans taking what the Greeks had said, now you've got a complete mess. Nothing makes any sense, because you're so divorced from the original texts that now everything is mythologized. But the original story, the Egyptian story, they said, no, it wasn't a myth. These people were real physical beings. And in the Turin Papyrus, they can actually date all the lineage of these physical people going back to 36,000 BC.
Wow.
Exactly. And that gets a little problematic for archaeologists. But to the Egyptians, they said, no, these people used to live a long period of time. One of the original gods, which was Ra, not just the god of the sun, but a god, a physical person, he lived for over 800 years. And the Sumerians also had enormous timelines when they said, yeah, people back then were living in enormous time spans. We can track our lineage back to over 140,000 years. They didn't even blink when they talked about this. So when you start looking at the original seals upon which all of these timelines are written, you begin to realize that the story of humanity is far, far older than we're being told.
Would you say that the work of Zecharia Sitchin, the late Zecharia Sitchin, was pretty pointed and spot on?
It was, and then people began to learn Sumerian, and they said, actually, he was beginning to shift the information to fit the theory. I think his early work was pretty spot on, but I think he fell into that trap of, oh, this has become very successful, therefore I'm going to now start fitting the facts to fit the theory. That's not good research. That's not where I tend to go. And again, I read those books when I was younger. That's kind of what drew me into this mystery. But the more I began to look at other people's work, and they're beginning to question Sitchin's work, and I'm not talking about from a skeptical point of view. From an academic point of view, let's say, what does Sitchin call this? And he would call it something. But they said, but that's not what the word means, not in any length or shape or form. And he began to manipulate the story in order to fit that theory. And that's where you have to sort of draw the line with Sitchin. But again, I don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think he helped us focus on a period of human history where no one had really questioned before. So his work is very useful. But again, part of it you also have to begin to question because it doesn't make any sense. It gets into that sort of conspiracy theory and personal opinion. Now, it's great having opinions and it's great to do some conjecture, but there's so much conjecture that we start losing track of the facts, and that's where I like to go back to the original texts and find out what they were saying and put myself out of the equation. I don't want to give my opinion and add to the muddle. I want to go back to the original stories and see how they cross-reference around the world. Because if you start cross-referencing things in different cultures, they begin to make a lot of sense. If you let them speak for themselves, they make a lot of sense.
Where does New Zealand fit into all of this, Freddie?
Oh, this was a huge surprise. I had no idea this was coming. I spent 6 trips to New Zealand. I was given a book that was the written tradition of the group of people called the Waitaha. No one's ever heard of them. They originated in Easter Island. They actually describe being on Easter Island before the flood. So this story goes back to 12,000 years at least. And they describe how back in the day, they used to every year welcome the canoe of the gods. They used to come from some big landmass, which is now sunk in the middle of the Pacific, and they used to give out knowledge and information, and they used to elevate the tribe. And then they used to disappear somewhere called the birthplace of the gods. Now, fast forward, the flood happens. They described the events of the flood, the fact that the gods were in the middle of the Pacific when the flood hit, and they were lucky enough to be in deep water, so they were able to survive and reach New Zealand. Now, a couple of generations go by. Their progeny show up back on Easter Island. There was one woman called Hotu Matua. Nice to have a female sort of hero for a change. And she basically was described as the net of the world. She was a master navigator, comes from somewhere to the northwest of the Pacific, and her job was to map the Pacific, because where there used to be land masses, now there were islands. Now, this is an incredible story. And she again is described as being very unusual, very tall, red-headed, blue-eyed, white skins. And in the meantime, there's another god, another progeny of the gods that survives the flood, comes from a big landmass in the east, which I presume to be South America. And they met on the Easter Islands, and then their son decides to figure out, we need to go back to New Zealand to honor the birthplace of the gods. And you follow the trail of the story back to the South Island of New Zealand, to this incredible, incredible landscape temple. I can't get enough of it. And I read more of the Waitaha story, and they were saying that this is the place where the gods basically were born. It's an incredible sight. But the thing that really stood out for me in the story was that they said that there was a calendar stone there. Now,
Hold on right there, Freddie. We're at the top of the hour already, but we'll let you finish that story. We'll take phone calls, and we'll talk more about The Missing Lands by Freddy Silva. Well, get your place in line. We're going to take calls this hour with Freddy Silva. Phenomenal work with The Missing Lands. I've got a few more questions for him, then we'll start taking calls right here on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Noory with you, along with Freddy Silva. Freddie, we were getting into New Zealand and the amazing things happening there, and the break got us. So I'll let you wrap that part up.
In 5 words or less.
Yeah.
So basically, the son of these gods that kept showing up in Easter Island and New Zealand, who are called the Urukeu, by the way, and there'll be a test on these words later, by the way. This gentleman who went all the way to the South Island to look for the birthplace of the gods is called Maui, which is an Egyptian word called a navigator. And he gets there, and he sets up a calendar stone, and this is in the White Heart Traditions, which has just been published. And I went there looking for this calendar stone. There's a lot of stones there. I have to look for a calendar stone, and I believe I found it. And one of the 3 alignments that it gives me was extraordinary, because the first time that you see one of the 2 prime constellations in that part of the world, and one of them is the Southern Cross, of course, but the other big constellation in the Pacific is Orion, same as in Egypt. And the alignment of this calendar stone to the complete first rising of the constellation of Orion over the horizon is 10,400 BC in the winter solstice. Now, anyone that's familiar with the work of Robert Bauval and Adrian Gilbert already is familiar with that date, because that's the date that's given for the blueprint of the 3 pyramids at Giza. So one has to wonder now, what is the connection between the Egyptians and the gods of New Zealand? Well, they are described exactly the same way physically. They all have the same nickname of Shining Ones, and they also appear in South America, in Lake Titicaca, because it's mentioned in the White Heart Traditions that whenever they went back to Easter Island, because of the way that the currents flow, they couldn't go back to Easter Island. They had to go to South America, because they already had a homeland there for a long, long time. And they used to take 2 totem birds with them as a token of good luck. And the birds were called Titi and Kaka, which, of course, we know as Lake Titicaca.
That's right.
Exactly. And they already had a homeland there. The archaeologist Arthur Poznansky did a lot of work at Tiwanaku, the main site at Lake Titicaca. He took one of the main sites and he aligned it to the horizon stars, and he got a date of 15,000 BC. Now, this is interesting, because if they're going backwards and forwards to Easter Island, New Zealand, and possibly Egypt, because, they were master navigators, they're described in the same way, they had the same physical characteristics, they had the same nicknames. It's interesting that when I learned what the original name of Tiwanaku means, it means my people in Aymara. I have a very good guide in the South America who knows his language. And I said, but yeah, that's very interesting, my people. But Aku, the Tiwa and Aku, that's not an Aymara name. He says, no, you're right. I said, that's an Egyptian word. That means shining one, which is the nickname of the Anunnaki and also the followers of Horus in Egypt. And he said, that's interesting. So that means that Tiwanaku literally means the city of my shining people. So now we have a lot of connected things here, which is why I found this project so exciting. You have now the same gods in South America being the same gods of Easter Island, of New Zealand, and also Egypt, and by definition and by description, also the same people in Mesopotamia, which were the Anunnaki. So again, we're going back to this tradition of having one group of people going by different names all around the world, but they're all completely linked.
Freddie, would you also say that when we talk about these gods of South America, Kukulkan, Quetzalcoatl, there's another one called Itzamna, are we talking about many gods or just one?
I thought it was just one, and until I spoke to a very, very good Maya teacher in the Yucatan called Miguel Vergara. We do a lot of tours together. He is a walking encyclopedia, and he's piecing together the original Maya traditions, literally page by page, and we were discussing this, and he said, no, they're actually 3 different people. But it's interesting that they all arrived in the Yucatan Peninsula at the same time. And in fact, there's a date which is given in the Chilam Balam. It's 9600 BC. So within 100 years of the Great Flood, we have three groups of gods, three groups of 7 people who arrive on serpent rafts, because that was also their nickname, the people of the serpent, and it had nothing to do with snakes whatsoever. It was to do with the fact that they were basically in control of the laws of nature, and that was the symbol of the serpent. And Quetzalcoatl basically went north, Kukulkan went to the middle, and the Itzar, under this god called Itzamna, that hardly anyone knows about, they set up the original temple cities, which we now called Chichen Itzá. That's where the name comes from. They went to Tikal, they went into central Guatemala, and then they set up shop there, and they called their new homeland Lake Atitlan, which gives you a clue of where they came from, which of course was the Atlantic and the original landmass, which is Atitlan, or as we know it quite well, Atlantis. So they were very homesick to get the civilization restarted in Central America, and I quote, they went there to rebuild the former mansions of the gods. So everything that we see today in Central America, although it's been rebuilt again and again and again, it literally is a mirror image of what they had before. And so far, we have uncovered, 30,000 temple cities in the jungles between Yucatan and Guatemala and Belize. So there was a huge civilization there, and they literally had to start from scratch. They had to rebuild what had been drowned before.
Let's go to Joe now in Long Island, New York, to get things started east of the Rockies. Hey, Joseph, go ahead.
Yeah, Freddie, a couple of questions. I'm just speculating, but I'm wondering if there's any way to derive what the ships were. I doubt there would be shipwrecks that go that far back, but that would be the first question. Second question would be, in the Solomon Islands specifically, would there have been any way to canvass the islands and find one of these giants, being that, there was limited circumference? And also, are there any associated animals with these people that are symbolic or actually effective and maybe magical, such as, there's a lot of mystery with the eagle?
Wow, that's 3 questions. I can answer the last one pretty quickly. I don't know that one. The ships, yes, they're going to be pretty hard to find. I mean, these things apparently were built of wood.
Disintegrated at the bottom of the ocean by now.
Yeah, unless they're encased in mud, and the lucky turn of the archaeologist's spade comes across them, it'll be fantastic because they will be preserved in some way or another. But I can say during my research that they do describe them as being, they traveled without oars across the ocean, and in the Hopi traditions, they describe them as actually floating over the ocean. And again, we don't know if this was a sort of an image or a metaphor. There was one case where they described huge sails, which is the tradition of the Waitaha in the Easter Islands. And apparently the massive catamarans that they have today in Tonga and Samoa, and they are impressive catamarans, by the way, they're supposed to be echoes of the original canoes of the gods. They call them the wakas, by the way. That's the original term for them. But they said that they basically were very stable. They were huge. They could have 200-300 people on these massive catamarans, and they got around the Pacific effortlessly, as Tor Heyerdahl obviously proved during one of his voyages on a raft they took from the coast of South America all the way to Easter Island. And the other question
about the giants.
About the giants, this is fascinating because there are a lot of stories even today that the giants are still living in pockets inside the caves of the mountains of the Solomon Islands. And you think, this should be pretty easy to find out. Well, it turns out that the Solomon Islands are actually quite remote. They're very hard to get to. There's no roads that really go anywhere into the Central Highlands, unless there's a logging road or a mining road. But there were people who were doing mining there that said that on one occasion, and I believe it was a group of Americans who were there, and they said that one of our trucks actually veered off one of the dirt roads during a storm, and we had to walk all the way back to town. It was about 20, 30 miles. We had to go back and get a hinch and some equipment to get the truck out of this ditch. And when they got back there, the truck had been turned upright and back on the road. And the local people said, oh, this happens all the time. That was the giants that basically helped you. They're very shy. They keep themselves to themselves, and they live in these massive caves systems. They go through the cave systems, and they get around from A to B because the type of stone inside the caves is self-illuminating. And I heard that story again in the original Mesopotamian story of the flood, where you have two of the flood gods, who Yima was one of them. Noah was his counterpart in the Bible, but that wasn't his real name. Yima said that he had a window that was self-illuminating inside his boat. And I'm wondering if this is perhaps the same type of stone that exists in certain parts of the world that does give off a certain luminous quality in the dark. But certainly they say that they're still living there. We leave them alone. They leave us alone. They're very disconcerting because they're about 18 feet tall. And I've heard exactly the same story in the island of Tongareva, where the team of Osaka, from the University of Osaka, they went there to dig up some of the giants' graves. And this is a small island in the middle of the Cook Islands group. And this was about 15 years ago. I had this on personal information, direct information from the last wisdom keeper of Tongareva, and he said, my mother actually witnessed them digging up this 22-foot-long grave where there must have been a skeleton that was 18 feet long. And the archaeologists dug up the bones. They found urns and other pottery in there, perfectly preserved. And then there was a massive voice that came out, booming out of the lagoon, that said, you've seen enough. Time to put back the artifacts and go away. You're desecrating our grave. And it frightened the archaeologists so much that when I contacted them in Osaka, they said, we do not wish to go back on that story again. Just drop the story. We don't want to talk about it. But it's on record that they actually found an 18-foot giant buried in the island of Tongareva. So they do keep washing up in the north coast of New Zealand as well, and they were still living there as far as the 18th century, according to the Maori records.
Let's go to Bill now, truck driving in the state of Washington. Hi, Bill. Go ahead, sir.
Hey, Freddie. Hey, George. No, this is a great topic, and I got so many questions. But, just recently they discovered a human fossil in the Apatema caves in Greece, and that's on the Mani Peninsula. And what's really interesting about that is the religion of Manichaeism. Manichaeism is from what we call the Near East. They had a huge following. But Mani was depicted as being 100 feet tall. Well, we can laugh about that now, and that's a dead religion, obviously. But, it had a huge following. Manichaeism was huge. And I guess my point is, all right, there's an old saying that the oracle is not where the power is. The power is with the priest, even if they have to invent the oracle. All right. And what we've done is we put religion, and especially Christianity, in this small context. This really just relates to the 20th century. And no, this is really interesting what you're doing. And there's also like the Beringia hypothesis. These human fossils were hunter-gatherers that were moving, chasing game from point to point over the grassy, the grassy steppe-lands. But that does not account for the massive civilizations that emerged. Like the Beringia hypothesis is, there's a continent, a lost continent under the Bering Sea. Now that would account for the massive human civilizations that arose in North and South America. But, my question is simply, have you heard of the Tabby star and the occultation of the light that's coming from that star? Do you believe that could be a massive technological apparatus by this extraterrestrial civilization? And then my other thing, I'd like to get your opinion on the Chachapoya and the sarcophagi in Peru. Those are also very, really mysterious as far as their origins.
All right, Freddie, take a few of those if you want.
Ooh, those subjects are sort of slightly outside my sphere of understanding. I'd have to give you an opinion, and there's so many opinions already, but what I can say related to some of the topics that you were bringing up was that we are not going to find most of the places where these gods lived. And this was said to me directly. It was the most expensive phone call I've ever made to this tiny island in the middle of the Pacific, to this wisdom keeper. And he said, because you have to understand that, when the civilization was here, civilization that we inherited, because suddenly, even NASA described this in a study back in 1972. They were fascinated as to how humans suddenly developed civilization spontaneously around the world around 8000 BC. We inherited megalithic structures. We inherited astronomy, astrology, mythology, mathematics. It's as though we're all having the same hallucination. And his point was, yes, there was a civilization here before. There were many civilizations here before, but you won't find them because what went down, something had to go up. So where there was the Sahara today, there used to be an ocean there, and that obviously drained into the Atlantic, and the same in Arabia as well. In fact, he was making the point that the home of the Anunnaki, which is one of my big questions, used to be an island where today's Arabian Peninsula now sits, which really blew my mind. I had no idea that was coming. And he said the same thing in the Pacific. You talk to the Hopi and the Zuni, and they'll say, absolutely, we came from an island whose, it's 2:30 in the morning my time. I can't remember the name of it. But it's somewhere around the area where Samoa is today. All of that's gone. All we see today are the peaks of these massive land masses, and something else had to go up in its stead. So places like, Bolivia, that rose in a blink of an eye according to the local traditions, and yes, part of Lake Titicaca is still salty. There are many lakes that have salt water where there shouldn't be salt water. And they're saying these things literally rose in the blink of an eye, because when you have that much destruction with meteorites colliding with the Earth and 3-mile-high tsunamis, which can be proved, you're going to show that the geology that we have today bears no resemblance to what we had back then. So the remains of the civilization remain in the traditions and the mythology, except the mythology is nothing more than a theatrical method with which to tell you a history of a people. So, yes, there is plenty of evidence to show that the original stories of the indigenous people are closer to the reality of what we've inherited in the West today.
And that object that some people think might be artificial, I think is probably just some huge asteroid.
And who knows? But the one thing that I did find, and this is a huge revelation, was how all of these gods, without exception, around the world, are all related to each other by Orion. The name Orion keeps popping up again and again and again. And now, I've been around the block enough times to realize that things should be taken literally, and I thought, okay, maybe they're talking about a symbol, or maybe they're talking metaphorically. But the more indigenous people I've spoken to when I was researching the material for this book was, oh, no. This was a physical connection. They actually had the ability to go backwards and forwards physically from this constellation, and we interacted with these people. And after the flood, their messengers helped us survive. They set us on our course to human civilization, and then they vanished. They just disappeared. And they'll show up once in a while just to check in and make sure that we're okay. And I had this conversation with Clifford Mahuti of the Zuni tribe, and he said, yeah, they still show up in their flying shields once in a while, checking in, making sure things are fine. They still give us information, but there was a time back in the day when they could get backwards and forwards between the belt stars of Orion by some mechanism that is now hidden or lost. And they said also that once in a while they will take one lucky human being with them to show them how to live in harmony, and then bring them back to Earth and say, now teach your peers what you've experienced and be the example you wish to see. And that's how they did it. That's how they helped us go from barbarity to civilization.
Now, I would go if I could come back relatively soon. Wouldn't you?
Absolutely. But they're saying all in its right time. Every stage on the Earth has its own particular time. And the Tamil culture and the Indian culture agrees with this. They're saying that we're now in the time of the Kali Yuga. We have to go into godlessness and into war and into conflict in order to recognize what we've lost.
Hold on, Freddie. We're coming back for final calls in a moment. The Missing Lands will tell you where you can get the book when we come right back. Next hour, you will hear one inspiring story that you will never forget with James Templeton, so make sure you're part of the program. We're going to come back in a moment with Freddy Silva and take final phone calls as we talk about his work, The Missing Lands. And welcome back to our final segment with Freddy Silva as we talk about his work, The Missing Lands. Freddy, where do people get your book, by the way?
Oh, they get it straight from the author. Important to support the authors these days, and you'll find it on my website, which is invisibletemple.com.
Excellent. Back to the calls we go. Carol's with us now in Tallahassee, Florida. Hey, Carol, good morning.
Good morning. Yeah, 2:30 here. So much information. Thank you so much.
I'm glad you're awake as I am.
Yeah, so much information.
You both better be awake.
Well, you've kept me awake. So
Good.
much information you've got that fits in with all the information I've accumulated over the years. I first came across information on Lemuria, which came to be known as the lost continent called Mu, symbolized by the script letter M. Back in the 70s, I came across a book called, what was it now? Written by Richard Keener, called The Ultimate Frontier. The continent was so huge that it also incorporated parts of what's now southwestern Australia, which, according to the images I pulled up in the history that I read, was actually swampland. Its highest point in altitude actually was supposed to be what is now Hawaii. They did colonize, and they colonized. They did go across the ocean. They went to South America and parts of Western America. And I've also got books that I've read by James Churchward, who incorporated and confirmed that information in South America, I think, in the 1800s. I don't know if you've ever heard of that book, The Ultimate Frontier, but I have another question about, I'm confused about Atlantis. It seems to have been located, according to different sources, in different parts of the planet, and I believe Plato wrote about it. Can you say a bit more about Atlantis?
What do we know about Atlantis, Freddie?
Yeah, basically, the traditions have, depending on who you're talking to, I'm not talking about the academics now, so I'm going back to the original source material as far back as I can find. There are certain overlapping traditions here, and they often confuse three different events into one. We have to understand that there was three major catastrophes that spanned the period of about 3,500 years. They're called the Dryas periods. So there was the oldest Dryas, there was the old Dryas, and then the younger Dryas. This is the last one is the one that everybody keeps talking about recently. And basically, the three major catastrophes involve not just the global flood, which is 11,000 years ago, but also a flipping of the Earth on its axis. And I'm not talking about the magnetic field. I'm talking about the actual poles flipping. And there are several traditions around the world. Again, if these people weren't speaking to each other, their stories are identical, that the poles literally flipped upside down and the Earth went to a massive deep freeze. And it seems to come back the other way again over time. So the net result is that there's a lot of confusion as to where these land masses were. Originally, they were like Lemuria or Mul, as they call them in South America, and they still talk about it in the Andes, by the way. They still talk about Mul in classrooms, and the Aymara people. And they'll say that, yeah, there used to be a huge landmass, but that was a long, long, long time ago. We're talking 30,000 years. As the oceans keep rising, the landmass keeps disappearing, and new landmasses keep appearing. So with regard to Atlantis, the same thing happened as well. Much of it was occupying the central Atlantic ridge, according to the traditions that the Maya inherited, which is where the word, of course, Atlantis comes from. It comes from Atl. They weren't very big on vowels back then. And that's where the group called the Its came from that settled Yucatan. They were the name literally means a magician priest. And but even then they were saying it wasn't just the fact that there was an island in the middle of the Atlantic. There were also portions where the Sahara now is. There were other sections of islands also in the North Atlantic. You can't really begin to understand where this landmass was because so much of it has shifted over time. but certainly the central portion was definitely in the middle of the Atlantic ridge. But the influence of the Atlantean culture certainly was much far spread, because we hear about the Atlantean culture also being in the Mediterranean. I just came back from Sardinia and found some very interesting connections to that culture there, and also to the Anu and also to the Shining People there and the monuments that they left behind. But they were also saying that that's not exactly where Atlantis was. That's like one of their outposts, because the civilization was so large that they spread out. And that's where the confusion comes in, that some people even saying that it went as far as Egypt. Yes and no. The influence of the culture went as far as today's Egypt, but the Atlantis, the actual island was not there. And just to make the story even more confusing and interesting at the same time, there was a sister island, which is also now in the region where the Arabian Peninsula now is, which is the home to the Shining Ones, which is their nickname, also called the followers of Horus, also called the Lords of Anu, or the Anunnaki, or if you're an Indian, the Anunnaki, which means that they are a people of the serpent. So it is a confusing picture, but we're talking a spread here of over 40,000 years. In that time, geology has taken a very, very drastic turn on the Earth.
Why do you think, Freddie, we have had this lost knowledge? It just simply vanished, or, you investigate, you've picked up a lot of tidbits and facts, but generally it's gone, like how the pyramids were constructed. What happened?
You find it in dribs and drabs. I mean, what the traditions were saying was that the catastrophe was so overwhelming, the flood was so overwhelming that so much of the information is either buried or literally just destroyed. And we keep finding fragments of it here and there when the lucky turn of the geologist spade suddenly uncovers something, and we're just, it's almost like we're looking through the vestiges of someone's rubbish bin, but there's so much more going on that's now, 50, 100, 200 feet below the surface in sediment underneath the ocean. Robert Schock and I have had this discussion for many occasions, and he's saying, if you consider that most of these people lived on islands, which is my theory all along, well, if the island sank, there's very little chance that we're ever going to find anything unless we dredge something up. And luckily enough, back in, I think it was the 60s, there was a vessel off the islands of the Azores, which is supposedly the tips of the original landmass of Atlantis. They dredged up from 6,000 feet rocks and sand and parts of vegetation which used to be shoreline in 15,000 BC, and that was before the first major collapse of Atlantis. So again, it's pure luck that we find this stuff, but the biggest information is in the myth. You have to understand what myth is. Myth is a theatrical device for encapsulating historical events in a way that the audience can remember from age to age. Because if you and I were just talking about some guy traveling the galaxy to fight for good and evil, you go, well, that's kind of fun, but I'm not going to remember that. But if you dress that up as Star Wars, we're still talking about it 40 years later.
You got it. Yep.
And that's what Plato was good at. He was able to take the information that he was given through a Greek historian called Solon, who was given the information by the Egyptians. And Plato, being an initiate of the mystery school, said, I've got a great mechanism that will allow us to remember this story if people who are interested enough will read between the lines. So, of course, the academics will say, well, it's just myth, it's nonsense. But no, if you read between the lines and you're a geologist, you go, well, let's check this out. Well, yes, we do have sedimental information and evidence from the mid-Atlantic ridge that, yes, that part of the ridge was dry land in 15,000 BC before the first fall of Atlantis. So suddenly, Plato's story makes a lot of sense.
Let's go to J.D. in Indianapolis. Hi, J.D. Go ahead.
Okay. I hope I wasn't having a senior moment, but I thought I heard Mr. Silva say that there's some kind of connection between the Arabic word for the constellation Orion and the word Nephilim. Is that?
Yeah, it's old Aramaic. The old Aramaic word for Orion is Nephila.
And what's interesting, too, is Cairo means Mars.
Aha.
Which is fascinating. J.D., did you have another question, sir? Nope, I guess not. Let's go
definitely having a senior moment.
Let's go to Walter.
But it was a good one.
Allentown, Pennsylvania. Walter, go ahead.
Hi, George. It's always great to talk
Hey,
to
Walt. How are you?
you. Good. George, I agree with Mr. Silva when he said that there was obviously a sharing of information vis-a-vis the quote-unquote the great epic tale of the flood with the ancient Hebrews vis-a-vis the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians. They all had their epic tales of how they came about and whatnot. Now, you were just, I agree with Mr. Silva when he says that mythology is a way of conveniently conveying science, if you want to use the word scientific in quotes. At that point, there was no real science, but it was a way of conveying information from one generation to the next. But the problem is, from today's viewpoint, you can't let myth and religion substitute for science. George, I mean, obviously, George, you know where I'm coming from. Mankind, in my view, must come to the humbling, self-deprecating realization that we are the quintessential naked ape, George. And if we don't come to that realization, we're going to lose it all because, you have people over there with they're in a dark ages of mentality, and they have their fingers on nuclear weapons.
Well, they sure do. As a matter of fact, North Korea did a little launch today of another short-range missile, indeed. But
oh, what fun! It's all theater. No, but I kind of agree. I think that it takes, in order to get to the truth, I think we have to look at this from a multidisciplinary point of view, which is the view that I usually take when I'm writing a book. I like to look at different points of view. I like to blend in geology. I like to blend in archaeology, academia. I like to blend in myth, so religion. And then when you sit back and take yourself out of the picture and approach the whole, all the information and the evidence non-judgmentally, you let the facts speak for themselves. And then you may be in a position to determine what the truth may be. And even then, we will only be scratching at the truth because eventually, in any subject, only the people directly involved with any event know the actual truth. We're just trying to approximate the truth. We're hoping, as researchers, that we got the information correct, and we try to put the pieces together without our particular opinion in order to approximate the actual truth. So I totally agree. I don't think you can approach this subject from just the mythological point of view. I think science has to come into it. But science by itself can't explain most of the things that existed 10, 20, 30,000 years ago. And even most scientists, if you get them off the record, will also agree that so much science, so much new information is coming out so quickly that we're having to change our perception of what science thinks to be the truth because the evidence is shifting the parameters literally by the day. There's a new discovery happening every single day that is reshaping our understanding of how history works. So I think it's an evolving theory, what happened in the flood and also with the civilization that was here before. The more people approach the subject, the more we add to that pot of information, the more decisions we can make based on actual evidence, which comes from a multidisciplinary point of view.
But you can say, beyond a shadow of a doubt, Freddie, the flood did happen.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when you have 184 separate cultures around the world that describe it in exactly the same way, in the same method, even in Australia, I have 4 different stories from different Aboriginal people watching the waves coming from different points along the coasts and meeting in the center. And then we have the actual ballistics experts at Los Alamos that say, yes, a projectile of a certain size hitting, let's say, off the coast of Peru will generate a wave that is 3 miles high. And these people work, with peer-reviewed magazines and journals, and I've actually got the information in the book that speaks it in their own words. So when they're talking about in Tibet, watching the waves crossing the Himalaya, they were not making this up. These were eyewitness accounts. And that's what I find very plausible. And even geologists, and some of them, I won't mention their names because I don't want to put them on record, they'll say that, the Earth has shifted so much in 12,000 years that even we are approximating what may have happened. Because if there was water so much of the evidence has washed away. If there was a lot of water moving across the globe, then land masses would have shifted very, very quickly. And if anyone is listening here from New Zealand, you will know that 2 years ago, in 1 minute, on the South Island, with one earthquake, which was a 7.0 earthquake, you inherited 12 feet of coastline. I'm not talking about
instantly.
length. I'm talking about a rise in the seabed by 12 feet. That's in 1 minute. So imagine what a big wave will do.
In the last minute we have here, Freddie, the Bible talked about this flood being 40 days and 40 nights. What would have caused that? Just a constant barrage of these comets, or what?
It was the basic. It's like when, if you remember, when you're a young kid and you're in the bathtub and you're sort of moving your body in and out of the bathtub and you're watching the water slap across the sides of the bathtub and over the edge. That's essentially what was happening. There was ripples going around. Water was hitting coastlines. It was hitting mountains. It was going to and fro. It took a long time for the water to settle. It took time for land masses to readjust to the new reality, and also for water to go where it hadn't been before, and for water to also go where it hadn't been before. So there was a complete realignment of the Earth, as though basically the whole thing was made of jello. So imagine the whole thing having to, spend some time settling down, the geology settling down back to its normal method. And in fact, if you look at some of the traditions in the Yucatan and compare them to what they were saying in China, they were saying that in the Yucatan that the Earth, when 3 days and 7 days after the flood hit, that the sun stood still in the sky for 7 days.
Yeah, it was amazing. Freddie, thank you so much. The book is called The Missing Lands. Up next, a moment of inspiration. Don't go away. By all standards of success, our next guest, James Templeton, seemed to have it all. He was a highly successful businessman. He had a wonderful wife and a daughter, and only in his early 30s, seemed like he had his whole life in front of him. To avoid the same fate as his father and grandfather, who both died of heart attacks at a young age, James became an avid runner, a passion that he believed helped him stay fit and healthy. And imagine his shock when, during a routine physical, his doctor noticed a small mole on his body that turned out to be a melanoma, a dangerous form of skin cancer. The mole was removed immediately, and James, who was diligent in his follow-up exams, appeared to be cancer-free, but only for a short time. Up next, his story, I Used to Have Cancer. And welcome back to Coast. George Noory with you. We're going to do something differently next hour as well. I'm going to ask those of you who are current and past cancer survivors to give us a call and check in with us, and, of course, questions for our guest, James Templeton, as well. Let me tell you a little bit about James. He's a 30-year cancer survivor, healed himself from a terminal diagnosis with the use of alternative medicine and healing modalities. He has chronicled the journey in this book, I Used to Have Cancer, How I Found My Own Way Back to Health. As the visionary founder of the Templeton Wellness Foundation, James has since utilized his wisdom and experience to helping others achieve optimum health and wellness. And I always like to say this before we talk about programs like this. If you have a doctor, of course, consult your doctor diligently. I have no qualms with mainstream medicine. But alternative medicine, of course, has been one of our staples of support, and I think that's very important. I think you need to use both. And in James' case, let's find out what he did. Maybe he stopped the traditional medicine cold turkey. His book is called I Used to Have Cancer. And congratulations, James. I'm glad you fought this thing.
Oh, thank you so much, George. It's wonderful to be with you tonight.
It's much better to be with me tonight than not to be with us at all, isn't it?
Right.
Tell me, I read a little bit about the story when you went in for a routine exam. Tell me what happened.
Well, George, I'm from Texas, and I'm a fifth-generation Texan, and I've always been proud of that. And you can probably tell from my accent, I still have a little bit of drawl, even though I live in Idaho now.
Yeah.
I grew up in Texas, and I was living in Texas, and I was 32 years old. And I had a wonderful life going. I had a beautiful daughter that wasn't even 2 years old. I had a beautiful wife. I had several very successful businesses. And I just thought everything was going great. How could it get much better than that? And I guess you could say I thought I had life by the tail. And I even was in really good physical fitness shape. I was one of these guys that you'd see running down the road everywhere, and people would say, there goes that guy again running down the highway. You know, I was one of those guys.
That crazy guy. There he goes, huh?
Yeah, and I worked out all the time, and I was really into all this. Now, I wasn't always like this, but I got into this because I had a lot of death in my family. My mother died before I was even 2 years old. I had a brother die at the age of 8. My father died at the age of 46, and my grandfather died at the age of 36.
Oh, gosh.
And my father, grandfather, they both died of heart disease. And when my father died, I was a senior in high school, and I just thought that, you know, my world came to an end then, you know, and I just didn't know what to do without my father, you know, and I kind of gave up on life for a while, and I thought I wouldn't live to be 30 years old, so, you know, I just had this kind of who cares attitude for a while, even when I went to college.
No, you're right. As boys, we look at our fathers as our living barometer. I just remember my dad died at the age of 88, James, but, you know, when he got to 60, and I, of course, was way younger than that, I went, I'll get at least to 60. And then when he got to 70, I went, my gosh, I'll get to 70. Then when he went into his 80s, I went, this is a pretty good run. But, you know, he took care of himself. He wasn't into the supplements and the alternative medicine as much as I am. But we look at our parents as our barometers, don't we?
We sure do, and we really depend on them. And then when my father died, you know, I just never thought I was going to go much longer. I figured I'm probably next. But lo and behold, I found out about running and how helpful it could be. There was a guy back then, and his name was Jim Fix. And Jim Fix, I'm sure you remember Jim Fix back in the 1980s. And Jim was one of these guys. He was considered a runner's guru and a fitness expert and fitness guru, really. And he wrote the book, The Complete Book of Running. And I read his book, and it got me interested in thinking that this was going to stave off this heart disease thing that was rampant in our family. And I didn't want to have that, so I got into this, and that's why I was into that. And one day, I went to my office at one of my businesses, and I sat down, and I grabbed the newspaper, and the morning newspaper, and the first thing the headline says is, running guru Jim Fix dies of heart attack.
Yes, I remember that. Oh.
And I couldn't believe it because he was kind of the guy. He was my guru, you know. He thought you could eat just about anything, do anything you wanted as long as you exercised all the time. So I thought, well, if he can do it and if it's good for him, I'll do it. But now, here I'm looking at this guy that died on the side of the road, and I'm thinking to myself, you know, what am I going to do? You know, am I going to keep doing the same thing? Maybe I need to change gears here a little.
And how old are you at that point?
32 years old.
32. So you're getting kind of close to your grandfather's moment.
Yes. So I started to realize, you know, when I looked back at it, and, you know, sometimes when you're doing all this exercise, you're tired all the time, and you push yourself, and you think it's just because, you know, from all the exercise and everything. But I noticed how I was getting tireder, and I was getting sick a lot. I was getting the flus and colds and allergies to every time in allergy season. Here I came with all these, you know, stopped up noses and allergies. So I realized that, but I thought, well, I guess you just don't feel as well when you're 30. When you get to be 30, you know, you're getting older. So I kind of just wrote it off to that and pushed myself harder. But anyway, I just decided that I better really check into things and get a better outlook on how my health was really doing. So I decided to go in to get one of these cardiac stress test things where they get you on the treadmill.
Sure, that's right. And now the technology is even better, James, where they can do these coronary digital scans and see inside your arteries without any surgery.
Yes, they've got so much better technology nowadays for all that. But this was the test that I went in, and I went in to see a specialist, and he did a very thorough exam of me, And he got me on the treadmill test, and he says, my God, James, he says, you're in tremendous shape. Because I was running up to 60 miles a week.
That's a lot.
And, yes, I was in really good cardio shape. And this guy says, my God, you broke the record in my office. He said, no one's ever done this well. He says, you're in tremendous shape. He says, you're the picture of health. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. And he says...
were you into alternative medicine at the time in terms of
No,
supplementation and stuff like that?
I didn't do anything. I just basically ate. I was trying to keep my weight down. I ate a lot of salads and things like that.
And ran a lot.
Ran a lot. Probably didn't support myself very well because I didn't take any supplements. And on the weekends, I'd go run these runs, these 10Ks and half marathons and all that kind of stuff.
Were you winded?
Oh, no, I was in pretty good shape.
Yeah, okay.
And I wasn't the fastest runner, but I held my own,
You finished. That's
got
important.
Up there. I was in the top 10 usually. So I did pretty well, and I was, trim and fit and worked out in the gym 3 or 4 days a week. But this guy says, you're the picture of health. And he says, I think you're going to live a long time. I wouldn't be worrying too much about the heart thing. And he says, after a thorough examination, he looked at me and he says, well, there's only one thing that I see that you might want to look into. And I said, what's that? And he says, well, you got a mole on your back.
And how would you know unless somebody told you, right?
Yeah, well, I didn't know. And I had several moles on my back, and it was in a spot where you couldn't even see it. And the guy says to me, he says, look, he says, it's probably nothing, but if I was you, I would just go in and get it checked out at a dermatologist.
He saw something, didn't he? He did.
He saw it. He kind of thought that it might be something I needed to have checked.
Was it irregular or something like that, James?
It was. It was kind of irregular, and it had different kind of shape to it than the other moles.
Yeah.
And it was kind of had some dark and light colors in it. It was different looking, but I never really even noticed it because it's right in there. I mean, you can't see it hardly. You can't even hardly.
How big was it?
Oh, it was probably about half the size of a dime.
Okay. Pretty kind of a big size mole, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he says, I'd get it checked out. So I did. I decided a few weeks later to go into a dermatologist's office. And I went in, and, the lady at the front counter says, look, go in there and take your shirt off and sit on the table, and the doctor will be in. So I'm sitting there, and the doctor comes in, and he says, well, what seems to be the problem? I said, well, I had a cardiac stress test, and the doctor said that I had a mole that looked a little different. So he says, well, let's look at it and see exactly what it looks like here. And he goes around the back of me, and he just stopped there for a minute. And, I mean, he jumped up and down like he had won the lottery. I never seen anything like that.
Oh, boy.
He says to me, he says, oh, my God. He says, I think you might have melanoma. Just like
Jeez, even without a test, a biopsy.
He did, and he got very, very excited and very, very weird acting. And he says to me, he says, look, he says, this is bad stuff. He says, I know it's melanoma. He says, we might have to do a lot of surgery and remove a large portion of tissue on your back. He says, we've got to get after this. He says, you could die from this. Well, here I am, a guy that thought he had life by the tail. I'm sitting in this office, and the guy's scaring the heck out of me.
Yeah, I'm going to die from a mole on my back. Jeez.
I didn't really like his bedside manner, George. And you know what I said? I kind of mumbled and said, well, I'm going to get back to you.
Really? You put it off?
I got out of there because I didn't like the way he was all, giddy and excited about it.
Was he like giddy in a happy way?
Yes, and he like he was very...
Like I found a melanoma, one of those kind of guys?
Yeah, like, my gosh, I don't know if he'd ever seen it or not in person, but he thought that it was that. So I went back home, and I was shaking in my boots, couldn't even hardly drive home, and I lived 10 miles from town. And when I got home, I told my wife what was happening in a very, upset voice.
And not to get too personal, but she never noticed it?
No, I guess not.
All right.
Because, it's one of those things where, we all have moles on our body, not everyone, but you don't pay any attention. Somebody that really knows would say, wow, that's not quite normal, But
So you tell her what the doctor said, and what does she do?
Well, she says to me, why don't you get a second opinion? And I said, that's a good idea, and she says, let's find another dermatologist to go see. Well, I'd been to one before, so I decided to go to him, and I was living outside of Houston, north of Houston, a small town. So I went to this dermatologist down in Houston, and I went in to see him, and I said, hey, Doc. He says, oh, I remember you. And he says, have a seat. And I told him what the problem was, and he says, well, let's look at it. He says, it looks suspicious to me also. He says, but, a lot of people have melanoma, and it's usually stage 1, and we can usually get it all, and it's not going to be a problem probably down the road. But he says, you know what, just for safe measures, I'm going to send you to a world-renowned oncologist friend of mine. And he says this.
Now, at this point, did he snip the mole off?
Nope, he didn't do anything. He sent me right on down the street. He had his nurse call and get an appointment for me for the next day. And I went in to see this oncologist at this cancer clinic. And he looked at it, and he says, looks suspicious to me also. But he says, right there in the office, he says, but, we're not going to know until we just remove it. And he says, I can do it right here in the office. He said, let's remove it and send it in to the lab and see what it is.
Which was the smart thing to do.
Yes. So after going to these other two guys, I ended up in this guy's office having it removed. And he took a big plug out of my back. It was probably 2-inch square. It is really deep.
Oh, my God. And what did they give you an injection for an anesthetic or something?
Oh, yeah, and all that. I didn't feel it. But stitched up, it was quite a big chunk out of my back. So
was it deep, James?
It was. And so he tells me, he says, you go on home. Don't worry. I'll get back to you in a few days. Well, all I did was go home and worry. All you do when you get...
Oh, of course, waiting for your biopsy results.
You're walking around in circles on pins and needles. You don't sleep at night. You're just not, a happy camper, as they say. But he calls me up, and it was nearly 2 weeks later. And I didn't know why it was taking so long. But he calls me up, and he gave me one of those phone calls, George, that you don't like to hear.
Oh, my God. What did he say?
He says, I got some good news, and I got some bad news. Well, I didn't know what to think, but he went on to tell me the good news is that you have melanoma. And I'm thinking...
That's good news?
Good news? And he goes, well, wait a minute now before you start drawing conclusions here. He says, it's, melanoma, but we think we got it all in that area, around the incision, in the perimeter area of that incision. So we couldn't find any cells, cancerous cells, in the outer area. So we think that's good news. And then he went on to say the bad news is, he says that it's very deep.
Yep.
And he says it's deep and on a scale that they call the Clark scale. He says it's stage 4.
Out of 5.
And he says stage 4 melanoma. And he says, now this is serious. We've got to really keep an eye on this stage 4 melanoma because it's probably going to spread somewhere.
Did you have to go back for radiation or chemo or anything like that?
Not yet. I didn't do it yet. But what he told me, he says, you're going to have to come in every 3 months and let's check it out to see if everything looks okay. He says, there's nothing I could do at that point. He says, try not to worry, live your normal life, go back to work, just try not to worry. So all I did was worry. All I did was walk around in, circles, and I became very depressed.
Did you still run and do everything you were doing?
I quit everything.
You quit everything.
I just got so depressed and so down because we didn't have the internet back then. So I knew that melanoma wasn't a good thing. I didn't know much about it, but I had read a little bit about how people died from cancerous moles, and I started to talk it around, and there was a doctor friend of ours that said that, and I couldn't believe he said it, but he said that people with stage 4 melanoma usually didn't live over 3 years.
Unbelievable.
So anyway, I guess he thought he was helping us out. But after that, I kind of just went into a downspin, and and I didn't want to do anything. I lost my ambition because I was a very ambitious guy, and I was, wanted to go places in life, and I just didn't. I wasn't fun to be around, and I didn't even want to go to the office.
You basically gave up.
I was giving up, and my wife, even saw how I was. Of course, she was living with me, and it started to take its toll on my marriage.
Of course.
And after about 6 months of going to the doctor, everything looked okay, but here I would get a little better, then I'd go back into this tailspin. And before I knew it, my wife decided to move into town and take my daughter into town. So after that,
She basically left you?
Yes.
Oh, God.
And after that, I basically gave up. And I said, I don't even care if I live or die. That's just kind of how I was feeling about it. And, and of course, now I didn't have any signs of melanoma spreading. But before I knew it...
Hold on for a second, James. We're at a break. We'll pick it up right there when we come back. His book is called I Used to Have Cancer, which is a good thing. It's gone. And his websites are linked up at coasttocoastam.com. Next hour, when we take calls, questions for James, and if you had or have cancer, I'd like for you to call us too. And welcome back to Coast to Coast. James Templeton with us. His book, I Used to Have Cancer. In a moment, we'll talk about some of the things that James did to fight this dreaded illness and disease. So at this point, James, you're dealing with a guy, you're relatively cancer-free at the time, I guess they're saying, right?
Yes, they're saying everything looks okay, but the first thing I knew, after about 6 months or so, I found a lump in my groin, and I was taking a shower, and I knew that wasn't good, so I went in to see the doctor, and the doctor says, well, let's get in here and see exactly what this is. He says, I want you to check into the hospital first thing in the morning.
Ugh.
He says, chances are it'll be just a little biopsy. It probably won't be much to it. But when I woke up from that surgery, I knew I was in trouble because it wasn't some little biopsy. It was huge bandages all on my groin area. And the doctor comes in soon after I was, waking up. And
So they knocked you out for this?
Oh, yeah, I was in major surgery. So what had happened is they went in and removed all of my lymph nodes on my right groin, and it was just like a 10-inch incision.
God.
And, they just gutted me. And the doctor comes in, he says, well, James, he says, I'm sorry to tell you the cancer has spread to your lymphatic.
Oh.
And he says, that's not what we wanted, of course. He says, this is something we're going to have to get very aggressive with because this kind of cancer really is nasty stuff. And he says to me, I want you to do 80 chemotherapy treatments.
80?
80. And he wanted me to do experimental chemotherapy because he said that was this experimental hypothermia kind of treatment where they elevate your temperature to 105, maybe even up to 107.
Oh, my. You're in a constant fever.
Yes, so they would do that and then stimulate your immune system and then induce the chemotherapy. And he says, with all these lymph nodes being removed, we're going to have to do a lymph drainage pump also because we don't want you to get lymphedema and end up losing your leg.
Oh, my God.
So here I am.
Was there a big hole there in your groin?
Yes. So he says to me, this chemotherapy will start after you recover from the surgery for 2 weeks. You'll just stay here in the hospital for 2 weeks recovering, and after the third week, we'll try to do the chemotherapy and do 5 treatments. And these treatments would last about 10 hours, and they were IVs.
You would have been better off if an extraterrestrial captured you and took care of you.
I know it. And so he tells me, he says, I hate to tell you also, he says, I think you only have a 20% chance of surviving 3 to 5 years if we can get get this you through these chemo treatments. He said, if you don't do the chemo, he says, I don't think you have much of a chance.
Now, I've got to assume that the cancer, the melanoma, and then the groin cancer may not even have been related, just separate episodes of cancer. Is that possible?
No, but he said it was melanoma and had spread, and it went from my back to my groin. And he says once it's in there, it's bad news usually, and it'll spread pretty fast. So we have to get aggressive. So anyway, I'm laying there, and I'm really desperate. And now I feel like my life is over.
It's done.
I feel like there's nothing I can do. I'm very depressed. I just didn't have much to look forward to at all, or no hope. And I'm laying there, and a few days later, recovering, all high on morphine and everything else from the pain, and I get a phone call right out of the blue, and it's a minister on the phone. It's a preacher at a church that I went to on a semi-regular basis. He calls me on the phone. He says, listen, he said, James, he says, I've been praying for you. He says, I know many people that have been praying for you.
So everybody knew about your condition.
Yes, they knew in town, because I was a businessman, and I had several businesses in town, and I guess I was halfway well liked, but who knows? But anyway,
all you need is one good one.
That's it. And he tells me, he says, look, he says, I want you to fight like you've never fought before. He says, you're a runner, and I know you know how to push yourself. See, this guy was an ex-professional baseball player, and he was a runner also, and I knew him pretty well, and he was a really nice guy, but a tough guy. And he tells me, he says, I want you to fight like hell. And he says, you beat this something cancer, and I'm not going to say what he said.
No, you can't. Not on the radio, Jimmy.
It shocked me. And I never heard him speak like that. He says, if anybody can do it, you can, and you don't forget that. He says, you're not all alone. So I want you to remember that you can beat this. So anyway, I'm thinking really hard about that, and I just started to pray after that phone call, and I prayed really hard. And I wasn't a guy that was religious, really. I was a decent guy, but I didn't pray very much. Probably should have, but I started to pray, and I mean it was a prayer out of desperation because I needed to find an answer.
Did you start the conventional treatment?
Not yet.
Not at that point.
Started. So I prayed really hard because I was trying to find an answer. I knew there had to be something else I could do, and I just felt that intuitively. And I started to pray, and I felt like every cell in my body was praying. I felt like I was praying 100 times more than I'd ever prayed before, asking God to help me. And, I just woke up after that prayer, and it was about 20 minutes later, I got a knock on the hospital door. And here comes a friend of mine that I hadn't seen in over 7 years from college. And he had these papers in his hand. He's waving them around, and he says, I heard you were in here. I heard from one of our old friends, and he says, I didn't know whether I should come or not, but I was driving around the area close to the hospital, and I was thinking about you, and something told me to just stop. It was time to stop no matter what and see you. And I wanted to bring you this book review article he had in his hand. It was about a guy that cured himself of cancer using a diet and lifestyle.
Was it Ty Bollinger's book?
No.
Okay.
It was just it was a book, and the book was actually written by a guy by the name of Dirk Benedict. And Dirk Benedict, you might remember, was on a show called The A-Team.
Mm-hmm.
And he was the younger guy, the blonde-headed guy. They called him Face in the show, and his real name was Templeton Peck on the show. Well, my last name's Templeton, and I didn't even realize that for a little while. But when I did, I said, "Boy, is this
that's weird
or not?"
Yeah.
I mean, and isn't this something? So anyway, I got this article from my friend, and I just knew I was supposed to do this. It just felt like this was from the higher place, the higher power. And I said, I'm going to do this. My friend says, you don't even know anything about it. So I said, I'm fixing to learn about it right now, but I'm going to do this. Well, it was about a diet, and the diet was called macrobiotic diet, the macrobiotic diet. And I'd never heard of them.
That's the chewing diet, right?
Yeah, and I'd never heard of
My uncle used to do that in Massachusetts. He would chew his food like a cow chews cud. We would all laugh as kids, but he ground that food up. He chewed 100 times.
Oh, well, I can tell you I chewed 180 times. And it sounds crazy, but I eventually did because they recommend 50 times. And I went all out and said, if a little's good, a lot's better. And I went to 180 times. But anyway, this story, back to the story, here I am. And I'm looking at this book, and I'm getting excited because if it'll work for old Dirk, why won't it work for me? He got well I can do it. Well, I could relate to him. I relate to the way he thought. And I told my friend, can you go out and get this book for me? And he said, yes, I can. He brought it back. I got very excited. I couldn't put the book down. I was very excited. Now I started to gather some hope. I started to feel a different energy inside of me. My old energy was starting to come back. And so the next day, I got another knock on the door that came to the hospital next morning. And here comes through the door my stepmother that had a book in her hand. And she brought this book in, and it was a book about cancer and vitamin C. And it was by Linus Pauling and Ewan Cameron. Well, I said, let me see it. And I looked at it, and it said people that took high dosage vitamin C tend to last a lot longer, especially for people that were terminally ill. They seemed to live a lot longer, and a lot of people got well. Well, I got excited about this, and I said, well, if it'll help those people, why won't it help me? Well, I'm going to eat the macrobiotic diet and do the lifestyle, and I'm going to also do vitamin C now. So now I'm starting to put together a plan, and I felt like this plan came from God or whatever you want to call it, from the higher place. And I was really starting to get some momentum and some belief that if these people could do it, I could do it too.
Now, are you out of the hospital by this time?
No, I'm laying there in the hospital.
Still in there, okay.
I'm miserable because of the surgery. But the next day, I got another knock on the door. So I had 3 knocks in 3 days on the door from people that brought me things
that you hadn't seen in years or whatever.
Yeah, and this guy that comes through the door, the next guy is the psychotherapist from the hospital, from the cancer floor, the cancer ward.
So you didn't know him?
No, never met him. So he comes in, he says, look, I'd like to talk to you. I hear you're having a rough time. I hear you're pretty depressed, and can I come and talk to you? And I said, sure. So he came in the next morning, he comes through the door, and I said right off the bat, have you ever heard of something called macrobiotic diet? And he says, hold on a second. He took off towards the door. I thought he was leaving. I thought, oh, boy, I said the wrong thing. Well, he comes back in, he sits down next to me, and he says, yes, I have heard of the macrobiotic diet, but he says, I'm not going to tell you what I know until you promise that you don't share this information and this conversation with anybody around here. I don't want to lose my job. I don't want to lose my pension and all that kind of stuff. So I knew then that I was really on to something. If this guy was going to share something with me in secret. So he went on to tell me that he had seen a lot of great things with this diet. A lot of people had gotten well. He said that it really seems to work for a lot of people, but he says there's a right way and a wrong way to do it. If you do it the right way and you put 100% into it, he says you can do it. It takes a lot of work and a lot of determination to carry it out. But he says, I think that you could do it because he says, by the way, you don't seem to be very depressed after all. He says, you seem to be actually excited about something here. So he went on and he gave me 2 books to go and read because he told me these 2 books, and they were books by a doctor that had cured himself on the macrobiotic diet. So I had my friend go out and get me these 2 books, and I read those books. So now I'm really excited, and before I knew it, it was time to do the chemotherapy. Well, I did the chemotherapy because I wanted to do everything. I thought if a little's good, a lot's better, and I'll just do it all. And I got into the chemotherapy, and it was terrible.
Oh, it is. It is bad stuff.
And I felt really bad, and
but it could help at that time.
It could could have, and I thought that it would because that's all I knew. And everybody talks about chemotherapy.
Did you do radiation too?
No radiation. The doctor says we might have to do radiation, but we'll do chemo first and see how it goes. So long story short, I ended up doing another 5 treatments after leaving the hospital for 2 months and starting my diet, trying to start it the best I could. I went back into the hospital and I did 5 more treatments.
Did you lose your hair at that point?
No, they put this cap on my head that was had almost like it was ice cap, and my hair fell out, but not totally. It was starting to fall. It thinned out. I don't think it ever.
And now it's grown back
the way it was. But anyway, I did these other treatments, and I was sick, really sick, George. I think they must have doubled or tripled the potency of it because I really was really sick. I couldn't eat. I couldn't keep anything in my stomach.
And it's an IV. That's how they give it to you, right?
Yes, and they got my temperature up, and you felt like you were shaking in the bed, like you were freezing to death. They had these blankets, these weighted blankets on me, and they would get my temperature up, and then they would induce the chemotherapy through a separate IV. And this was usually about 8 hours long. It was a slow drip. And you lay there like you're in a torture chamber.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember laying there one day, and I was just about unconscious, and I had no life in me hardly. And I was losing a lot of weight, and I remember hearing a nurse come in, and of course my eyes were closed, and I was out of it. And she says, "Oh my God, who's been watching this man's temperature? His temperature is way too high."
God.
He said, "This man could die from this. We've got to get his temperature down. Get some cold ice and towels."
They're going to fry you. Jeez.
So here they come in and start trying to cool me down, and that upset me. And I said, I got to get out of this place before I end up
before they kill you.
dead in here. Because every night somebody nearly would die. They'd roll somebody down the hall at night. I'd hear about it. And they weren't dying from the cancer. They were dying from pneumonia or kidney failure, or something like that because of all this chemotherapy. So the chemotherapy was weakening their immune system so much more that they couldn't survive. And it was terrible. And I thought, well, if I don't get out of here, I'm going to be the next one. So the doctor comes in shortly after this episode. He comes in and he says, "Well, I hear you're not doing too well." And I said, "Well, I'm just so sick, doctor. I can't keep anything in my stomach. I feel weak. I just feel like I'm dying in here." And I said, "Isn't there something else I can do?" And he says, "Well, this is all I know to do." And I said, "Well, what would you do if it was your son or daughter?"
Hold on, Jim. We're going to come back in a moment and find out how you got out of that hospital and what you did. I used to have cancer, and, of course, we'll take phone calls. If you are a cancer survivor, if you have cancer, if you've eradicated cancer, check in with us as well. All right, this is the interactive portion of the show. We'll take your phone calls, questions for James Templeton, how he used to have cancer, and then we'll also take your stories if you have had cancer, or if you do now, you can share that story with us as well if you are so inclined. We'll be back with the calls in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Okay, welcome back. Our final hour with James Templeton. So, Jim, you're in the hospital. You're getting these chemo treatments. At what point did you say enough is enough and you walked out?
Well, when I talked to the doctor, he says, "Look, you're not really responding to the treatments like we had hoped." And he says there's nothing else he knew to do. And I asked him, I said, "What about a diet or vitamin C therapy, anything like that?" And he said, "None of that stuff really works." Well, it made me really mad when he said that because I had all this hope built up inside. And I basically reared up in the bed, and I said, "Listen, if I could get out of this bed, I'd tear you apart." I mean, I was just...
Wow.
And the doctor, and I said other things too, but the doctor looked like he'd seen a ghost, and he ran out the door. And I never saw that doctor ever again, and the only time I heard from his office was like 2 years later. They wanted to know, they called my ex-wife, they wanted to know if I was still alive. And I think she said something like, "Yes, but no thanks to you," but something like that. But, I just made up my mind when I left that hospital because I snuck out at 2 in the morning. And I just decided that night, I said, I've had it, and I'm out of here.
So did you basically cure yourself all by yourself?
Well, what I did was I got on the macrobiotic diet and high-dose vitamin C, and, I wasn't doing well. I wasn't responding to the chemotherapy, and I didn't want to stick around to find out what might happen next. So I left, and I really dug in, and I made up my mind that I was going to go to war, and I was going to beat this cancer. If anybody could do it, I could, and that was kind of my battle cry. And I got on the macrobiotic diet, which was remarkable for me. And after about 3 months on this diet, really being strict, I felt like a different person. I started to feel, just about like high on the food.
Does that diet tell you what to eat or just how to chew it?
It does, because it consists of like 50% whole grains, organic whole grains, and 25% organic vegetables. And a lot of the vegetables, most of them all, are cancer-fighting vegetables. They're the cruciferous vegetables, the allium vegetables like garlic and onions and leeks. But the cruciferous vegetables are very, very powerful and, very detoxifying. And the whole grains are like, using a broom or something to detoxify. And they're prebiotics. And they help with your gut health, your probiotics. 80% of your immune system is your gut health.
So using the vitamin C, James, and the special macrobiotic lifestyle diet, what point did you go back in for a checkup and they said, it's gone?
Well, you know what? I never went back to this doctor. I went to doctors that did specialized testing, and I went to other doctors eventually. But I was just kind of, went cold turkey. I was really a renegade. And not that I recommend everyone doing that kind of thing, but I just said, I've had it, and I'm not going to do it. But anyway, but my way. I was going to live the macrobiotic lifestyle and eat the diet, and take the vitamin C. And I learned later on how important vitamin C was, because I think that really helped me more than anything, because the high dose vitamin C really seemed to turn me around really quick, and I started to really recover and have a lot of energy really fast.
How long went by before that hospital departure to when you were cancer-free? How many years?
Well, I'd say it's probably about maybe a year and a half.
That's all? Wow.
Yeah. I had no more problems with it. I felt like a different person. It really, really changed me. I lost some weight.
Was it a gradual situation in terms of losing the cancer, or was it one day it was there, one day it was gone?
Well, here's what happened. I was eating this diet. The diet's very powerful because it's very, very, detoxifying, and it has all these cancer-fighting foods, and it restores your gut flora, and it's alkalinizing. Cancer doesn't do well in an alkaline environment.
Right.
And it keeps you regular.
And it loves sugar, doesn't it?
It's very low in sugar, this diet. So yes, it does. It loves sugar, and I chewed my food, like I said earlier, a lot. So I really made it easy on my digestive system. So I felt very, very good. But what I noticed one day, I was laying there in the bed, and I felt this liquid around my legs, and I didn't know what the world it was. This was probably 6 months after I was on this diet. So I looked down, I had these two openings, one on each leg, and there was this gray, like graphite-like liquid coming out of my legs, and like down in between my knee and my ankle.
Where did the openings come from?
Well, I'm assuming that it was coming from the detoxification, because I saw this. I eventually ended up living at the macrobiotic community, that the main source place for macrobiotics out in western Massachusetts. And I saw a lot of people with similar kinds of situations. When they would get on this diet and lifestyle, they would start to really detoxify. The body would just start opening up, and sometimes they would have open sores that would just drain.
Did you take other supplements, James?
I did.
Eventually?
I took a lot of supplements down the road, but right then all I did was vitamin C. And vitamin C is not really recommended on that diet, but, again, I was a renegade, And I found out about it through the Linus Pauling book. And then, down the road, I discovered why the vitamin C works so well. Because at that point, I was just going by that first book.
So what would you say was the most important thing, the macrobiotic diet?
I would say it all is, because
it's a
you
package.
got to get on a really strict diet when you have cancer, and you got to get off the sugar, like you said, and you got to build up your intestinal flora, because that's 80% of your immunity. And and I believe now you have to, of course, take certain supplements, because I've learned a lot over the years. But it was very, very, very powerful diet. And, you didn't eat a lot of meat or anything, didn't eat any meat. For 6 years, I had no meat. All I had was maybe fish once a week, like white meat fish once a week in a soup. But it was just remarkable. And you just feel so good, because, you didn't feel hungry. You could eat all you want. And I just think it's a great diet for someone that's going through cancer. Now, I don't follow this diet now, because I feel that when you're on a healing diet, that's not the diet you need to stay on forever.
Do you get monitored on a regular basis?
I do all kinds of different testing nowadays. There's tests out there. There's a test that I do that tests for cancer proteins in the body, nagalase.
And you're cancer-free right now?
Yes. And
good for you.
It's been 33-plus years.
How important was prayer or anything like that to you?
Well, I did a lot of visualization. I did prayer. I did meditation. When I chewed my food 180 times a mouthful, which sounds ridiculous, but it's liquefied, and it really does work, because it really kicks in your enzymes, the amylase, to help break down the food.
I bet when you sat down for dinner, you left the next day.
Oh, I would sit there. It'd take me an hour to eat a plate of brown rice, vegetables, beans, sea vegetables, all the things that we ate. So I would sit there and I'd chew my food, and I didn't see anybody chewing like me, because I was living in a community with like-minded people. I was on the staff at the Cushy Institute at that time, that was in Western Massachusetts. So I was the guy that was trying to set the example, and, I wanted to be the guy that people looked up to. So I was not going to cut any corners.
Well, let's take some calls. You're going to get some questions, but you're going to get a lot of stories from people who have had cancer or do now. Let's go to Leonard in Davis, Oklahoma to get started. Hi, Leonard. Thanks for calling.
Hey, George.
Good to have you with us. So you have a question, or did you have or had cancer?
Story myself, kind of like your guest. I had a stage 3 melanoma about 2 years ago.
And you're still going strong. What did you do?
Well, it was if you survive for 5 years, you made it. That's what they informed me of.
Did you go the conventional way with medicine, or did you go natural and holistic?
No, I had surgery. They did an excision on my back.
And do you still go in to get checked out once in a while?
Every year.
Yeah, that's smart. Yeah. But you're cancer-free right now?
Right now, yeah. It's been
good for you.
How long did you say it has been?
I'm kind of proud of your guest. I mean, he had stage 4,
Oh yeah, he had 1 foot in the grave.
That's what they told me,
How long ago was this, Leonard?
This has been about 22 years ago.
Gosh, that's a long time, James.
Yeah, I had a mole in the middle of my back, and
same thing.
It was about the same size as your guest described.
It seems like a lot of times it's where you can't see the mole, and I think it gets away with it sometimes.
Did you go out in the sun a lot, James?
I worked out in the sun, but I was really exposed to a lot of petrochemicals, because I had gas stations when I was young. Some of my businesses were gas stations, and I was pumping gasoline all the time. And I lived, and breathed this stuff all day long for 10 years or so. And I also was a pipe fitter when I was younger, and I used a lot of PVC glue. So I really think that was one of the big problems, because of the toxicity, the petrochemical toxicity.
What do you do for a living now, if I can ask?
Well, what I do now is I'm in the nutritional supplement business. And I started a company. One night I woke up with an idea in the middle of the night to start a company. And, that's what I've done for the last 28 plus years.
That's working. And how do people get your book? I Used to Have Cancer.
They get my book if they go to iusedtohavecancer.com. They can get 3 free downloads. One of the downloads is the 5 top supplements that I recommend. The other one is 10 diet recipes that I really think are very helpful for me and for prevention. And also there is a guide to my daily activities, the way I live my life, the things that I do every day. They can get that absolutely free. And there's a link to Amazon and link to Barnes & Noble and other booksellers, but they have to go there to get the book if they want to get the downloads free.
James, do you think if you were on a natural supplement program prior to this cancer episode that you may never have even had an issue with melanoma?
I think probably not, because there's so much out there now and so much research out there, and I know so much more. I didn't, like I said, I didn't support myself, and I was running myself in the ground and, draining myself. My immune system was down because I was sick all the time, and so I didn't really listen to my body. And, it's no wonder when you have, a low immune system, you're just looking for trouble.
Yep, absolutely. Let's take some more calls, and I've got some more questions. This hour's flying by. We go to Sherry outside of Denver. Welcome to the program. Hi, Sherry.
Oh, hi, George.
Good to have you with us. So what was your situation?
Well, in 95, 92, I had, I can't remember what the stage was, but I had ovarian cancer. In 99, I went to Virginia to take care of my brother who had melanoma stage 4. I had breast cancer.
Oh, boy.
And now, about a year or so ago, we just took 2, well, they were only stage 2 melanomas off of each side of my chest. Anyway, 20 years ago, my brother had the stage 4, and it was out there taking care of him, and so that was about 20 years ago, and he's still alive. They gave him.
Good for him.
He had like 6 surgeries and chemo and a year's worth of chemo and everything. Then he had prostate cancer and had radiation and everything. So he's had 2 major cancers and is now 75. And I'm on 3rd cancer, and I'm 77. But anyway,
you're winning the fight.
I guess I just always kept thinking, well, we're Scottish, we're tough. And I kept positive thinking, and it took us a long time to get over it, but we're still here and still going strong.
Good for you. Keep fighting. Go ahead, Jim.
I was going to say the Scottish people are tough.
They sure are. Are you familiar with Edgar Cayce, the late American prophet?
Yes.
He said once in one of his readings, he was very good at this in his trance state, that eating 3 raw almonds a day would prevent cancer. Not cure it. He never said it cures it, but would prevent it. And I've been doing that for years now.
Well, I've heard that too. It's kind of like, something that, I've heard many years ago about that. I think there's a small amount of maybe B17 in that almond.
Which is Laetrile, right?
Yeah, I believe so.
It's in apricot seeds, too.
Bits,
Yep.
Or, the B17, the Laetrile. And I've heard a lot of good things about Laetrile, even though you can't get it in this country. You got to go to Mexico. But I interview people at my foundation. I have a foundation, Templeton Wellness. And TempletonWellness.com, you can go to it. But I interview people with late-stage cancer that have pretty much all, healed themselves for 10 years or more using alternative methods. And I thought that if I do that, it would give people really a lot of hope And a lot of the people, I find that I interview that have miraculous stories, better than mine even, that people that were written off and given 6 months to live and stuff like that, pancreatic cancer, you name it. A lot of these people used Laetrile, to get well, and some of them claim they got well in just a matter of weeks.
Dramatic stuff. Next up, let's go to Barry in Rock Hills, South Carolina. Hi, Bear.
Hello there, George, and have a great time in Miramar. But listen, I've got a great story for your guest, and I've never had cancer, but I'm telling you, I sold pharmaceuticals, as you know, for 20 years.
Yep.
I'm a biochemist without a PhD, but do not ever take chemotherapy or radiation. I'm telling you, it's a passport to death. And I'm glad for your guest that he has conquered it, because he is 1 in 10,000 that get over what he had. Thanks, George. Have a great time.
Well, he's a survivor, to be sure. And, I'm not so sure anybody should just simply walk away from chemo initially. I think there've got to be some medical practitioners out there, James, who'll work with you in both ways, holistic and conventional.
Oh yeah, they are, and and I'm one of these people. You need to ask your doctor when you find out that you have cancer, and most of us find it out through conventional doctors. But you got to find out kind of, what are my chances, doc? What are my chances? And they sometimes won't tell you unless you ask. So if you have a 1% or 4% chance, or if you have a 80% or 90% chance, you need to know, because you have a really high chance of surviving maybe the conventional.
Absolutely. James, we're going to come back and take some final calls with you in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. On our next Coast to Coast program, we're going to talk about creativity and then witchcraft. We've got it all for you on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back, James Templeton with us, our final segment. James, have you heard of the work of the doctor in Italy who uses soda bicarbonate to attack cancer?
I have heard of that, to create alkalinity in the body.
Yeah, Dr. Simonacci, I believe his name is. And,
I haven't talked to anyone personally that has used that program, but I've heard of it.
But, for some reason, the conventional medical world, when they team up with governments, they go after these guys.
Oh, I know.
In a big, big way.
That's right. Anybody that's doing good things, usually they go after, or they run them out of the country.
Remember the Hoxie clinics from years ago?
Oh, yeah. And
same thing.
There's so much going on out there, and there's a program with vitamin C where they did a 15-year study, and found that cancer was a collagen disease. And they used vitamin C, lysine, proline, and EGCG, which is a green tea extract, in this study for 15 years.
Now, do you mean a lack of collagen?
No, they build the collagen up with the vitamin C, the lysine, proline, and the EGCG, and when they build the collagen up, the cancer can't metastasize very easily. The collagen is like the connective tissue, of course, so it can't force its way through that to get into other parts of the body, into organs, and create inflammation.
What if you have a natural basis of collagen? Does that help you?
It helps, I think, but the vitamin C, most people that are low in a lot of these things, and and their immune system's low and everything else. But cancer, has nagalase, is the enzyme that spreads through the collagen layers. So lysine itself can kill the nagalase, because if you take enough of it, and this study shows that lysine, proline help build up the collagen, and vitamin C also. So when they built it up over 15 years, it stopped most major cancers in its tracks. And Dr. Rath and Linus Pauling did this study, Dr. Matthias Rath, and I was going to say that, they gave him a hard time because of this study.
Sure.
And, he had an ad once in the USA Today paper that said the end of cancer as we know it, something like that. And, it's amazing, because I've seen so many people do so well with high-dose vitamin C and using lysine and proline, and EGCG.
Well, you have to be very careful what you say on the air about cures.
Oh, yeah.
You can't say this cures this cures that. You can only say it helps.
Well, they had double-blind one study. It was a 15-year study that really showed this, and it was really important for people to know about this. But that's what happens to these studies. They get pushed out of the way a little bit.
Let's go back to the calls. First-time caller Dan in Seattle, Washington. Hi, Daniel.
George, how are you?
Great. Thanks for calling. And how about you? What was your situation?
Well, I'll tell you, I was 26 years old, diagnosed with a germ cell tumor that was basically a birth defect. And by the time they found it, it was as big as my hand.
Oh, my God.
And between the chest wall and my lung on the right side.
Oh.
And so we did the chemo thing, had 4 rounds of that. They went in, they took it out. They originally had said they were going to have to take the upper third of my lung, but as it turned out, it was so badly damaged they took the whole thing.
So are you with one lung, or did you get a lung transplant?
No, just one lung, and that was 27 years ago this summer. So I'm 27 years with one and 26 years with both.
Now, what's it like having one lung? I mean, how does that affect you, if it does?
It does a lot. I'm very slow. I get winded if I go upstairs too fast, but I just try to hang in there and, do what I can and, just try to hang in there with Jim and all the rest of the survivors and hope that everybody else has, as good luck as I did. And I got to tell you, George, we met at the Everett live show. That was a very great night. And I know you got another one coming up this weekend.
Yep, down in Florida. You should come over for it. That's a poke for you, though, from Seattle.
A little bit, but yeah, we'll talk soon again, I'm sure. But
all right, Dad. I'm glad things are going well for you.
I really appreciate it. We'll be in touch. Thanks, George.
Okay, great. It's heartwarming, James, to hear these kind of stories.
Oh yeah, there's so many good stories out there, and there's people, you name it, they've done different things, and a lot of people had great results with both conventional and alternative.
Let's go out to Devika in Miami, Florida, where I'll be this weekend. Hi there, Devika.
Hi, George. I've spoken to you before. I was lucky enough to be on your show. I'm the lady who does the special need animals.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And I'm the one who wanted to have the sanctuary and teach kids with special needs and animals with special needs to learn how to realize they're perfect in every way. George, in this cancer, we've done both parts. I do it with my husband. He's the one who has your birthday. He called in also. His name is Denise. And George, we've rescued a cat. Her name is Calypso. She was from Paris, dying, with a druggie beating her up. She had a lymphoma when she was 3 months old. We did the chemo, and then when she was cured. And then at 13 years old, she had a fibrosarcoma from a vaccine, and she went through the chemo, the removal of the cancer. She went through the radiation, and she died cancer-free at 17 years old.
Wow.
And on the other hand, where you're going to really like this, we rescued a cat that was going to be taken to the shelter. His name is Magic. He was going to be euthanized because he was on the street, couldn't see, couldn't walk. And a friend called us, and we spoke to the shelter person, the officer, and he released the cat to us. George, it took us a year and a half, and we did it through spiritual healing.
Good
we did
for
it through
you.
Holistic vitamins. George, we used a vitamin. Okay, it reboots your own stem cells, and it's a blue-green algae.
Oh, yeah, that works. I take it.
Yes, and I'm so happy to talk to you. Thank you for being on the show. And the blue-green algae, it reboots your own stem cells. We also tried other things, and, it was a matter nobody else ever cured feline leukemia, or if they did, we never heard about it. And it's very contagious to other cats, and through a SNAP test and then the lab work, Magic was, diagnosed with feline leukemia. And we said, no, we're not going to have this cat euthanized. We're going to rehab this cat. We took the energy of the sun to heal his body, meditation. We learned about Reiki healing, something we didn't really know about. And the power of the hand and the healing of the hand. We took the moon. We stole the energy of the earth. And with the vitamins that rebooted his own stem cells, it's like kale, it's like all greens, it's vitamins, and we fed him all holistic food, and we meditated my husband and I, with this cat every morning at 5 o'clock, and we were both full time, but we made sure we meditated.
Well, you did it. You turned it around.
A year and a half. And then, our vet, we took him into the vet. His SNAP test was negative, but his lab test was positive. We said, oh, no, we're not going to give this up. And we said, okay, let's do it. We have a wonderful vet. And I said, give us another month, a month and a half. We took him in, the lab test, negative of feline leukemia. And then, of course, we're not going to mix him in right away because it's contagious. Then we waited a little while, and we continued with the healing of the earth, the healing of the sun, and the healing of the group.
It all works, doesn't it? It all works. Hey, you coming out to our show in Miami?
I am in. My husband and I are in seats H109 and 110. George, we will be there. You are our idol. Right. You're our hero. I cannot wait.
We will meet you at the meet and greet after the show. Okay.
I am so happy to meet you, and thank you for everything. You motivate us so much. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. We got a great audience here, James, don't we?
Oh, you do. You got a great show. I listen to you all the time.
And that's something. So, in terms of the personal life, did you ever get back with your ex-wife, or did that just?
No. But my daughter works for me now, and she's my marketing manager. So we have a great relationship, and I have an office in Texas and one in Idaho, and she works in the Texas office, and everything's good. Everybody's good, and I've got a wonderful partner now, and
good.
She's a wonderful gal. So it's all good. Everything's good. And
what did you learn out of all of this entire exercise? What would you do all over again?
Well, if I had to do it all over again, I've learned a lot, and I've learned a lot of treatments, and things that you can do. But I thought probably would use a diet very similar. I'd probably cut back on some of the grains, because a lot of the grains nowadays are high in things like arsenic and cadmium. So, I'd probably cut back a little bit on that. But other than that, the diet was great. But I follow a really healthy diet now, and everything in the book, I used to have cancer, is in there that I do today. Everything I did, in the past to basically get over this cancer scare that I had. And you can read about it in there, and I give a list of all the vitamins and the supplements that I use nowadays, and the detox treatments that I use. I love a far infrared sauna. That's my favorite thing, to get in there, because it's very detoxifying. From the toxins and heavy metals and chemicals and pesticides that we all have in our systems. And it's very, very good for the immune system to stimulate that, and it oxygenizes the system. But that's my favorite thing to do. And I exercise, but I don't run like I used to. I walk, and I do deep breathing. And while I walk, because it's very important, and I do coffee enemas from time to time, and colonic irrigation. And and sometimes I do hyperbaric chamber treatments, because I believe in the pressurized oxygen and how important it is. I do so many things. People ask me, "Are you really going to take all that?" I go out to lunch somewhere. They can't believe I take all these supplements, but that's one of the reasons I got in the business, because
you got to do it.
Knew that I need to take care of myself, and I don't take it for granted, and I want to be able to stay healthy so I can help other people and give them hope and set the example. And I've never stopped doing that. I'm, right on track all the time, and I just have a great life nowadays.
Let's go to Margie in Portland, Oregon. Welcome to the show. Hi, Marge.
How are you? Thank you, George, for
Sure
taking
thing.
my call, and especially thank you for mentioning Hoxie. I am a 45-year survivor of stage 4 melanoma, malignant melanoma.
Good for you.
And I did not do what they wanted to do here. It was too debilitating. I got the 1974-75 brochure from the American Cancer Society, which said that with treatment, people with melanoma had a 20% chance of living 18 months. And I figured, I don't gamble, but I could have got better odds than that in Vegas.
Yeah.
Anyway, I went to the Hoxie Clinic in Tijuana, Mexico. I've continued to go down there. It's been a few years because I'm now 86. It's a little harder to travel these days. But I cannot tell you how fabulous.
Well, you don't sound 86, Marge.
I don't feel 86. I feel like I'm in my 50s.
Good for you. You're like my mother. She's 90, and I had her on the air on her birthday in May, and she actually asked me, "Are you going to give me more than 2 minutes?" And
there you go. The main thing with the Hoxie Clinic, they treat with diet and an herbal tonic and vitamins.
Wonderful.
And it works. It's wonderful. At one point in time, I can't tell you what they say now, but at one point in time, they claimed an 80% save ratio, and you have to realize that many people do not go down there until it's the last
too
moment.
late. That's right.
But
well, I've heard a lot of good things about the Hoxie treatment also. I've interviewed people that have done very, very well with the Hoxie treatment.
Wasn't that, didn't that originate when a fellow by the name of Hoxie spotted his horse eating certain types of grasses and got better?
Yes, and he was living in, I think, Dallas, Texas at the time. And then, of course, he ended up in Mexico, his clinic now. But, he's not living, of course. But, yeah, I think so. It's funny how these people discover these different herbal treatments. And this Hoxie tonic, is famous.
Take a moment, James, to tell folks how they can reach you, send you emails, get your book.
They can reach me at templetonwellness.com, James at templetonwellness.com. They can get my book, I Used to Have Cancer, How I Found My Own Way Back to Health, at IUsedToHaveCancer.com, and get 3 free downloads. And the free downloads are the 5 top supplements that I recommend, the top 10 diet recipes that I like to use, and my daily regimen, the things that I do every day to keep healthy and keep this cancer away.
How old are you now, Jim?
I'm 66 years old.
You're 66. Let's make a pledge to have you back every once in a while and have you go to 90 at least.
Oh, I'd love it. It's what I plan to do, and that's why I started the foundation. I got tired of my friends, family, and colleagues dying, and I had a 30-plus year survival, and I wanted to, try to help them with my story and give people hope. That's all they need. They need hope and inspiration, and to be able to go out there and know that there's a better way, and cancer doesn't have to be a death sentence. It's all up to the individual which way they want to go. But I've seen enough of it, and I want to help as many people as I can.
Well, you beat it, and you keep on beating it. James Templeton, I Used to Have Cancer. For Dan Galante, Gina Salvati, Tom Danheiser, Lisa Lyon, Lex Lonehood, Sean Ladesseur, Greg Bishop, Stephanie Smith, Chris Burrows, Tim Badal, and George Knapp, I'm George Noory, somewhere out there on Coast to Coast AM. We'll see you on our next edition. Until then, be safe, everyone.